On a July morning in the year 1324, the streets of Cairo were choked with gold. Not metaphorically, not as poetry or exaggeration. The streets of one of the wealthiest cities on earth were literally glutted with the metal that had driven men to murder, to madness, to war since the first human hand pulled a yellow nugget from a riverbed and understood what it meant. Gold poured through the bazaars of the Mamluk capital like rainwater through a gutter. Gold pressed into the palms of beggars who had never held more than a copper coin. Gold heaped upon the floors of mosques where imams stood speechless, unsure whether to praise God for this bounty or to fear the man who dispensed it with such terrifying ease. Gold given to merchants, to soldiers, to officials, to complete strangers who happened to be standing in the wrong street at the wrong moment. So much gold that within weeks the metal would lose a quarter of its value across the whole of Egypt. So much gold that the economy of one of the medieval world's great powers would buckle under the weight of a single man's generosity and would not recover for more than a decade. The man responsible for this catastrophe was not a conqueror. He had not arrived with siege engines or cavalry or any instrument of war. He had arrived with something far more destabilizing. He had arrived with 80 camels, each one carrying 300 pounds of pure gold dust in leather saddlebags, and he had arrived with the unwavering intention of giving it all away. His entourage stretched for miles. 60,000 people moved through the Egyptian capital in a column that took hours to pass. Courtiers in silk, soldiers in leather armor, scholars reciting verses from the Quran, musicians beating drums whose rhythms had never been heard in this part of the world. 12,000 enslaved servants walked in ordered ranks, each carrying a bar of gold weighing 4 pounds. The procession moved with the discipline of an army and the splendor of a dream, and at its center, mounted on a horse whose saddle was wrought from gold, sat a man whose name most Egyptians had never heard before that morning. His name was Mansa Musa. He was the emperor of an empire that most of the known world did not know existed, and he was, by any measure that has meaning, the wealthiest human being who has ever lived. What happened in Cairo during those summer weeks of 1324 would ripple outward for generations, collapsing markets, redrawing maps, reshaping the way an entire civilization understood the geography of power and wealth. A man had walked out of the deep interior of West Africa from a kingdom that European and Arab scholars had barely heard of, and with nothing more than his open hand, he had broken the economy of an established empire, not through malice, not through strategy, through the simple, devastating act of possessing more gold than anyone in Cairo had imagined could exist in one place, and through the religious conviction that God required him to share it. This is the story of that man, and of the empire he ruled, and of the pilgrimage that announced both to a world utterly unprepared for what they represented. The primary accounts of Mansa Musa's life and Hajj come from a handful of sources, each of them invaluable, each of them incomplete. The most detailed is al-Umari, a Syrian historian named Shihab al-Din Ahmad ibn Fadl Allah al-Umari, who visited Cairo roughly 12 years after Musa's passage and conducted extensive interviews with officials, merchants, and scholars who had witnessed the emperor's visit firsthand. Al-Umari was meticulous. He recorded not just the spectacle, but the conversations. What the Mamluk official said to Musa, what Musa said in return, the precise protocols of greeting, and the exact gifts exchanged. He understood that he was documenting something unprecedented, and his account carries the careful weight of a man who knows future generations will depend on his accuracy. A second crucial source is Ibn Khaldun, the great Tunisian historian and philosopher, widely regarded as one of the founders of modern historiography. Ibn Khaldun compiled genealogies of the Mali emperors and placed Musa's reign within a broader dynastic and political framework, drawing on oral traditions transmitted by West African scholars and merchants who had traveled the trans-Saharan trade routes. His account is less vivid than al-Umari's, but more structurally rigorous, more concerned with how the Mali Empire functioned as a political system. And then there is Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler who visited the Mali Empire in 1352, roughly 15 years after Musa's death. Ibn Battuta did not meet Musa, but he walked through the cities Musa had built, spoke with the scholars Musa had patronized. I observed the court ceremonies that Musa had refined, and recorded his impressions with the sharp eye of a man who had traveled from Tangier to China and considered himself qualified to judge any civilization on earth. His account is personal, opinionated, sometimes dismissive, and irreplaceable, because he is the only outsider who actually stood in the heart of the Mali Empire and described what he saw. Together, these three chroniclers, the careful Syrian, the systematic Tunisian, the opinionated Moroccan, provide the foundation upon which Musa's story rests. They did not always agree. They each carried biases shaped by their own cultures and agendas, but they agreed on one thing without reservation. The man they described was extraordinary, and the wealth he commanded was beyond anything they had encountered in the known world. To understand Mansa Musa, you must first understand the land that made him. And to understand that land, you must forget nearly everything the modern world assumes about medieval West Africa. The Western imagination, shaped by centuries of colonial narrative, tends to picture pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa as a vast emptiness, a place without cities, without states, without the complex institutional architecture that Europeans considered the hallmark of civilization. This picture is not merely wrong, it is the opposite of the truth. In the centuries when Europe was clawing its way out of the early medieval period, when London was a muddy town of perhaps 40,000 people, and Paris was only beginning to emerge as something more than a fortified island in the Seine, the savannah of West Africa was producing empires of extraordinary sophistication, scale, and wealth. The region that would become the Mali Empire sits in the western Sudan, not the modern nation of Sudan, but the Arabic term Bilad al-Sudan, meaning land of the black peoples, which referred broadly to the vast belt of savanna stretching across Africa south of the Sahara Desert. This land is defined by two great rivers. The Niger, which rises in the highlands of what is now Guinea, flows northeast through the savanna in a great arc before bending south toward the sea, a counterintuitive path that confused European geographers for centuries. And the Senegal, which drains the western reaches of the savanna toward the Atlantic. Between these rivers, and extending beyond them in every direction, lay a landscape of seasonal extremes. Searing dry months when the Harmattan wind blew fine red dust from the Sahara across everything, and lush wet months when the rains turned the same landscape into a green abundance of millet, sorghum, and rice. It was not the surface of this land that mattered most, however, it was what lay beneath it. The gold fields of Bambouk lay between the upper Senegal and Falémé rivers, in a region of rolling hills covered in scrubby vegetation. Here, alluvial gold accumulated in riverbeds and shallow deposits, and for centuries, perhaps millennia, the local Malinka and Soninka peoples had extracted it through simple but effective placer mining, washing river gravel through wooden sluices to separate the heavy gold dust from sand and stone. Further east, the gold fields of Bure, near the headwaters of the Niger, were richer still. The gold from these deposits was of exceptional purity, fine dust, and small nuggets that needed little refining and commanded premium prices in every market that encountered it. And then there was salt. To a modern mind, it seems absurd that salt could rival gold in value. But in the deep tropics of West Africa, where temperatures routinely exceeded 100 degrees and human bodies shed salt through sweat at rates that could become lethal, salt was not a luxury. It was a biological necessity. Entire communities in the southern forest regions had no local source of salt and would trade gold, actual gold weight for blocks of Saharan salt. The great salt mines of Tagaza, deep in the northern Sahara, produced enormous slabs of salt that were loaded onto camels and carried south across the desert in caravans that sometimes numbered thousands of animals. These slabs arrived in the markets of the Mali Empire's great trading cities, Niani, Djenné, Timbuktu, where they were broken into smaller pieces and traded southward into the forest zones for gold, cola nuts, and enslaved people. Gold flowed north, salt flowed south, and the empire that controlled the crossroads of these two flows controlled, in a very real sense, the metabolism of an entire continent. This was the inheritance that awaited Mansa Musa. But it did not spring into existence with his reign. It was built across centuries, through the rise and fall of successive empires, each one learning from the one before, each one extending the reach and sophistication of West African state building. The first great empire of the Western Sudan was Ghana, not to be confused with the modern nation of that name, which lies several hundred miles to the southeast. The Ghana Empire, which Arab sources called Ouagadougou, rose to prominence sometime around the 8th century and reached its zenith in the 10th and 11th centuries. It was centered in the region between the upper Niger and Senegal rivers, in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali, and its power rested on a simple but devastating strategic advantage. It controlled the southern terminus of the trans-Saharan gold trade. The Ghana Empire's capital, Kumbi-Saleh, was described by the 11th century Andalusian geographer al-Bakri as a twin city, one half Muslim, eyes with mosques and stone houses where North African and Arab merchants lived and traded, and the other half traditional, centered on the king's palace and sacred groves. Al-Bakri described a court of remarkable ceremony. The king sat in audience wearing garments of fine cloth, adorned with gold, surrounded by horses caparisoned in gold, attended by pages carrying gold-mounted swords. Dogs wearing collars of gold and silver guarded the royal pavilion. When the king held court, the sheer quantity of gold on display was calculated not merely to impress visitors, but to render them speechless. The Ghana Empire thrived for centuries, but by the late 11th century, it was weakening. A combination of factors, pressure from the Almoravid movement in the north, shifting trade routes, ecological stress from overgrazing and desertification, and internal political fragmentation or porimov, gradually eroded its authority. By the early 13th century, the empire had splintered into competing kingdoms, and the Western Sudan entered a period of upheaval from which a new power would eventually emerge. That power was Mali, and its founding was inseparable from the life of one man whose story would become the most celebrated epic in all of West African oral tradition. His name was Sundiata Keita. The Epic of Sundiata, as preserved by the griots, the hereditary oral historians and praise singers of the Mande peoples, is one of the great founding narratives of human civilization, comparable in its cultural significance to the Aeneid, or the tale of Romulus and Remus. Like those stories, it blends historical memory with mythic embellishment, and separating the factual core from the legendary accretions is a task that has occupied scholars for generations. But the essential outline is consistent across the many versions recorded from griots throughout West Africa, and the core events are broadly accepted as historical. Sundiata was born into the royal Keita clan of the small Mandinka kingdom of Kangaba, probably sometime around the year 1217. His father, Nare Magan Konate, was king, and his mother, Sogolon Konde, was, according to the griot traditions, a woman of extraordinary ugliness and a hunchback, chosen as the king's wife because of a prophecy that her son would become the greatest ruler the land had ever known. This detail matters because it establishes a pattern that recurs throughout the story. The future emperor comes from a place of weakness, not strength. He is marked from birth as improbable. Sundiata's childhood seemed to confirm the improbability. He was unable to walk. While other royal children ran and played, Sundiata crawled, his legs apparently paralyzed or crippled. The court despised him. His mother was mocked. When his father died, Sundiata's half-brother Dankaran Tuman seized the throne and drove Sundiata and Sogolon into exile, confident that the crippled boy posed no threat. The griots describe what happened next with the weight of revelation. In exile, the boy who could not walk somehow found the strength to stand. The traditions describe him grasping an iron rod, or in some versions a baobab tree, and hauling himself upright through sheer force of will, bending the metal or uprooting the tree in the process. It is myth. But it is myth that carries a psychological truth the griots understood perfectly. The future emperor's defining quality was not physical strength or inherited privilege. It was the refusal to accept the limitations the world had placed upon him. Sundiata spent years in exile, moving between neighboring kingdoms, building alliances, learning the arts of war and diplomacy, and then he returned. In the 1230s, the exact date is debated, but the Battle of Kirina is most commonly placed around 1235. Sundiata confronted the man who had become the dominant power in the region, Sumanguru Kante, the sorcerer king of the Soso people who had conquered Kangaba and most of the surrounding Mandinka territories. Sumanguru was feared as much for his supernatural powers as for his military might. The griots describe him as a man who could not be killed by conventional weapons, who kept a chamber of horrors in his palace, who wore human skin. Sundiata defeated him. The traditions say he used a special arrow tipped with the spur of a white rooster, Niumar, the one substance that could penetrate Sumanguru's magical defenses. The historicity of this detail is obviously suspect, but the Battle of Kirina itself is real, and its consequences were transformative. Sumanguru vanished, killed, or fled into the wilderness, depending on the version, and Sundiata emerged as the unquestioned ruler of a territory that stretched across the upper Niger. What Sundiata did next was arguably more important than the battle itself. He did not simply conquer, he organized. At a great assembly at Kurukanfuga, near the site of his victory, Sundiata proclaimed the Mandan Charter, known in the oral traditions as the Kurukanfuga. This was a constitution, a legal and social framework for the new empire. It codified the relationships between clans, established rules for trade, defined the rights of different social groups, and, remarkably, included provisions that some scholars have interpreted as early articulations of human rights principles, including protections against the mistreatment of prisoners and declarations about the inviolability of human life. The Mandan Charter was not written down. It did not need to be. The griots carried it in their memories, reciting it at ceremonies, teaching it to their apprentices, transmitting it across generations with a fidelity that modern scholars have found remarkably consistent when comparing versions recorded centuries apart and hundreds of miles away from each other. The griots were not merely entertainers. They were the living constitution of the empire. Sundiata established his capital at Niani on the upper Niger and ruled until his death, which the traditions place sometime around 1255. The cause of his death is uncertain. Some traditions say he drowned, others say he was killed by an arrow at a festival, still others that he simply died of natural causes. What is certain is that he left behind an empire, a legal framework, and a dynasty, the Keita dynasty that would rule Mali for nearly 2 centuries. It was this dynasty and this empire that Mansa Musa would inherit. Between Sundiata's death and Musa's accession to the throne, roughly 70 years passed, 3 generations during which the Mali Empire grew from a regional power into something genuinely extraordinary. Sundiata's immediate successors consolidated his conquests and extended the empire's borders. His son Mansa Wali made the pilgrimage to Mecca, an early indication of the dynasty's commitment to Islam and its desire for recognition in the broader Muslim world. Subsequent rulers were less capable. The griots and the chroniclers describe a period of palace intrigue, usurpation, and occasional misrule that is familiar to anyone who has studied dynastic politics in any civilization. Then came the moment that opened the door for Musa. The details are murky, filtered through oral tradition and the accounts of Al-Umari, who recorded what Musa himself told Egyptian officials about his rise to power. According to these accounts, the previous Mansa, a ruler named Abu Bakr II, or possibly Muhammad ibn Ku, became consumed by an obsession that seems almost fantastical. He became convinced that the Atlantic Ocean could be crossed. He assembled a fleet of 200 boats and dispatched them westward into the open sea, instructing them to sail until they reached the other side or exhausted their supplies. One boat returned. Its captain reported that the others had been swept into a great current in the middle of the ocean and had vanished. The Mansa was not satisfied. He assembled an even larger fleet. The accounts vary, but the number given is sometimes 2,000 boats, and this time he boarded one himself, he appointing Musa as his deputy in his absence. He sailed west into the Atlantic. He never returned. Musa told this story to al-Umari's informants in Cairo, apparently without irony or embellishment. He stated it as simple fact. His predecessor had sailed into the ocean and was never seen again. Whether this account is historically accurate or whether it was a diplomatic fiction designed to legitimize Musa's own claim to the throne, covering perhaps a more conventional seizure of power, remains one of the great unanswered questions of medieval African history. Some modern scholars have speculated that the fleet may indeed have reached the Americas, pointing to possible evidence of pre-Columbian African contact with the New World. Others dismiss the story as legend or propaganda. The truth may never be known. What is known is that Musa became Mansa, and with his accession, the Mali Empire entered its golden age, a period during which it became arguably the wealthiest, most culturally sophisticated, and most geopolitically significant state in the entire world. The empire that Musa inherited was vast. At its greatest extent under his rule, it encompassed approximately 500,000 square miles, larger than the nations of France, Germany, and Spain combined. It stretched from the Atlantic coast in the west, where the Senegal River met the sea, to the Great Bend of the Niger in the east, and from the southern fringes of the Sahara Desert in the north to the edge of the tropical forest zone in the south. Within these borders lived millions of people. Estimates range from 10 to 20 million, though precise figures are impossible. Speaking dozens of languages, practicing multiple religions, and engaged in an economic system of remarkable complexity. The empire was not a monolith, it was a federation, held together by a combination of military power, economic incentive, diplomatic marriage, and the personal authority of the Mansa. At its core were the Mandinka heartlands along the upper Niger, where the Keita dynasty's authority was strongest and where the capital of Niani stood. Beyond this core, the empire incorporated vassal kingdoms and tributary states whose rulers retained significant local autonomy in exchange for paying tribute, providing soldiers, and acknowledging the Mansa's sovereignty. The system was flexible enough to accommodate enormous cultural diversity. Animist peoples in the south, Muslim merchants in the northern trading cities, semi-nomadic Tuareg and Fulani groups on the margins, and rigid enough to channel the empire's wealth toward its center. And that wealth was staggering. The gold fields of Bambouk and Boura were the foundation, but they were not the whole story. The empire also controlled the trade in salt, copper, cowrie shells, textiles, cola nuts, ivory, and enslaved people. The last of these a reality that must be stated plainly and not elided in any honest accounting of Mali's prosperity. The trans-Saharan slave trade was an integral component of the empire's economy, with enslaved people captured in warfare or purchased from neighboring regions and sold northward to North African and Middle Eastern markets. This was not incidental to Mali's wealth. It was woven into its fabric, just as it was woven into the fabric of virtually every major pre-modern economy on every inhabited continent. To celebrate Musa's magnificence without acknowledging the human suffering that underwrote portions of it would be to tell a partial story. The gold trade, however, was the engine of engines. Al-Umari recorded that all gold nuggets found in the empire above a certain size belonged automatically to the Mansa, while gold dust could be freely traded by his subjects. This system served a dual purpose. It ensured a permanent flow of extraordinary wealth to the throne, and it prevented the market from being flooded with too much gold at once, which would have depressed its value. The Mansa, in other words, was not merely rich. He was running a sophisticated monetary policy centuries before European central banks existed, Caravans departed the Mali Empire's northern trading cities, Timbuktu, Djenné, Gao, and crossed the Sahara along routes that had been established for centuries, traveling north to the great oasis cities of the desert, and ultimately to the Mediterranean ports where European and Arab merchants waited with silver, cloth, horses, and manufactured goods to exchange. The journey across the Sahara took approximately 70 days. It was one of the most grueling trade routes on Earth, a crossing of nearly 1,000 miles of desert where temperatures could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit and where a mist water source meant death. Entire caravans sometimes perished, their bones and cargo swallowed by sand. Yet the profits were so immense that merchants undertook the crossing year after year, generation after generation. Even by the time this gold reached the Mediterranean, it entered the monetary systems of Europe and the Islamic world simultaneously. Historians have established that a significant proportion of the gold circulating in medieval European economies, minted into the florins of Florence, the ducats of Venice, the dinars of the Muslim states, originated in the mines of West Africa and passed through the Mali Empire's trading networks. When a Florentine banker handled a gold coin in the 14th century, he was, in a sense, handling Mansa Musa's gold. He simply did not know it. Musa knew it. And he understood, with a sophistication that belied the European assumption, that sub-Saharan Africa lacked political complexity, exactly what his empire's position in the global economy meant. He sat at the source. Everyone else was downstream. Into this empire, into this web of gold and salt and caravan routes threading across half a continent, Musa brought something that would prove as transformative as his wealth, a deep and sincere commitment to Islam. Islam had been present in West Africa for centuries before Musa's birth. Arab and Berber merchants had carried their faith along the trade routes, and it had taken root first among the merchant classes of the great trading cities, then gradually spread to the courts of the ruling dynasties. Sundiata himself appears to have been at least nominally Muslim, though the epic traditions preserve strong elements of traditional Mandinka religion alongside Islamic practice. The Mali Empire was, in religious terms, a hybrid, a state where Islam provided the framework for international commerce, diplomacy, and court culture, while traditional religious practices continued to thrive among the broader population. The two systems coexisted with a pragmatism that would have astonished the more doctrinaire theologians of Cairo or Baghdad. Musa's Islam was genuine, but it was also strategic. He understood that full integration into the Dar al-Islam, the global community of Muslim states, brought enormous advantages: access to the intellectual networks of the Islamic world, credibility with the wealthy merchant communities of North Africa and the Middle East, diplomatic relationships with the great Muslim powers, and the moral authority that came from being recognized as a righteous Muslim sovereign. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that every able Muslim is obligated to undertake at least once in a lifetime, was simultaneously a religious duty, a diplomatic mission, and though Musa may not have fully intended it, the greatest public relations exercise the medieval world had ever witnessed. He began preparing for the journey sometime around 1323. The logistics alone were almost inconceivable in their scale. 60,000 people would accompany him. This was not an exaggeration recorded by credulous chroniclers and inflated by time. Al-Umari's informants in Cairo, who had personally witnessed the procession, consistently cited this number, and the logistical details they provided, the quantities of food, the arrangement of camps, the number of animals, are consistent with a retinue of this size. 60,000. A city on the move. More people than lived in most European capitals at the time. Among them were 12,000 enslaved servants, each carrying a bar of gold. It's 80 to 100 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust packed in leather bags. Hundreds of horses, their riders dressed in Persian silk and brocade. Wives, courtiers, griots, imams, soldiers, cooks, grooms, porters, and scholars. The column, when it moved across the landscape, stretched from horizon to horizon, and the dust it raised could be seen from miles away, a pale brown cloud moving across the savannah like a slow, inevitable storm. The route would take them northeast from Niani across the savannah to the great trading city of Walata, then north across the Sahara to the oasis of Tuat, then east to Cairo, then across the Sinai Peninsula and south through the Hejaz to the holy cities of Medina and Mecca. The total distance one way was approximately 4,000 miles. Much of it crossed the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Musa departed Niani in the dry season sometime in late 1323 or very early 1324. The exact date is not recorded. What is recorded is that as the procession moved through the Mali Empire's own territories, it was greeted with the reverence due a living sovereign embarking on a sacred journey. The griots sang. The drums spoke across the distances, carrying news of the Mansa's departure from village to village. At every major town, the local ruler came out to pay respects, to offer provisions, to add his own retainers to the growing column. And then the column turned north, toward the desert, and the landscape changed. The Sahara did not announce itself with a boundary or a line. It crept in gradually, Rimaze, the grass thinning, in the trees dwindling to scattered acacias, and then to nothing. The soil turning from red laterite to pale sand, the air drying until a man's lips cracked and his nostrils burned with every breath. The Harmattan wind carried fine grit that worked its way into everything, into clothing, into food, into the folds of the camel's leather saddlebags. At night the temperature plummeted, and the caravan huddled around fires fueled by dried camel dung, the only combustible material available. By day the heat was merciless, a physical weight pressing down from a sky so pale it was almost white. 60,000 people crossing the Sahara. The water consumption alone defies easy calculation. Each person needed at minimum a gallon of water per day. The camels needed less, but they still needed to drink every few days. The mathematics of this: 60,000 gallons of water per day, minimum, carried on the backs of animals across a landscape where the nearest water source might be 5 days' march away, reveals the staggering organizational capacity that underpinned Musa's empire. This was not a feat that could be accomplished through wealth alone. It required planning, infrastructure, and logistical expertise of the highest order. Advance parties had to scout the route, ensure that wells were functional, arrange for supplies at oasis towns, and negotiate safe passage through territories controlled by Tuareg and Berber groups who might view 60,000 strangers crossing their land with something less than enthusiasm. The caravan pushed north, through the shimmering heat, through sandstorms that reduced visibility to a few feet and forced the column to halt, huddled against the camels waiting for the wind to die, through nights so cold that water froze in the leather skins, through landscapes of such absolute emptiness that a man might walk for hours and see nothing. No tree, no animal, no feature of any kind, just sand stretching to infinity under a sky so vast it made the human form seem not merely small, but irrelevant. A temporary arrangement of matter that the desert would absorb without noticing. And at the center of it all, carried forward by the faith that had set the entire enterprise in motion, rode Mansa Musa, the 10th emperor of Mali, the Lord of Gold, a man traveling 4,000 miles across the earth to kneel in a city he had never seen, and before a God he believed had given him everything. He had no way of knowing, could not possibly have imagined, that the simple act of giving away what he carried would change the economy of an entire region, redraw the maps of the known world, and burn his name into history with a permanence that neither his empire nor his dynasty would survive to share. The caravan moved on, northward, toward Cairo, toward the moment when the medieval world would learn what West Africa had always known: that the richest man on earth did not live in a palace of marble beside the Mediterranean, or in a castle of stone on the banks of the Seine, or in a fortress of brick along the Yangtze. He lived in a city of mud and gold on the banks of the Niger, and he was coming to introduce himself. Cairo in the summer of 1324 was not a city easily impressed. but it was the seat of the Mamluk Sultanate, one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, a military autocracy ruled by a warrior caste of formerly enslaved soldiers who had overthrown their masters and built an empire that stretched from the Nile Delta to the Euphrates. The Mamluks had accomplished what no other Muslim power had managed. They had stopped the Mongol advance at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, shattering the myth of Mongol invincibility and saving Islamic civilization from the fate that had befallen Baghdad 6 years earlier when Hulagu Khan's armies had sacked the Abbasid capital, burned its libraries, and reportedly turned the Tigris black with ink and red with blood. The Mamluks had also expelled the last Crusader strongholds from the Levant. They were men who had earned their arrogance through blood. Their capital reflected it. Cairo was a city of perhaps 500,000 people, one of the largest urban centers on earth. Its skyline bristled with minarets and domes. Its markets handled goods from 3 continents. Its scholars debated jurisprudence and astronomy in madrasas that were among the finest centers of learning in the world. Its sultan, al-Nasir Muhammad ibn Qalawun, was in the midst of his 3rd and longest reign, a shrewd survivor who had been deposed twice, imprisoned, exiled, and had clawed his way back to power each time. He had rebuilt Cairo's infrastructure, commissioned grand mosques and hospitals, and cultivated a court of considerable sophistication. He was accustomed to receiving foreign dignitaries. He was accustomed to displays of wealth. He was not accustomed to what came through his gates that July. The first reports would have reached the Sultan's officials well before the caravan itself arrived. The Mamluk state maintained an efficient intelligence network, and a column of 60,000 people does not cross the Sinai Peninsula unnoticed. But the reports, however detailed, could not have prepared Cairo for the reality. Because the reality was not merely large, it was of a different order entirely, a category of spectacle that the Mamluk court, which had seen Mongol ambassadors and Crusader kings and the accumulated pageantry of a dozen civilizations, had no existing frame of reference to process. The procession entered Cairo from the east, and it did not stop coming. Al-Umari's informants described it in terms that, even filtered through 12 years of memory, still carried the flavor of astonishment. The vanguard consisted of 500 enslaved servants, each carrying a staff of gold weighing 6 pounds. Behind them came the musicians, and behind the musicians came the horsemen, and behind the horsemen came the camels. 80 of them, some sources say 100, each one visibly burdened with gold, their saddlebags heavy and their handlers walking carefully to manage the weight. The women of the court rode in covered litters. The scholars walked in groups conversing. The soldiers maintained formation on the flanks, their leather armor oiled against the dust, their weapons, spears and swords forged in the smithies of Niani, alien in design to Egyptian eyes but unmistakably functional. And at the center, elevated above the column on a horse of exceptional quality, rode Musa himself. Al-Umari's account, drawn from eyewitnesses, describes a man of regal bearing and composed demeanor. He wore garments of the finest quality, silk and brocade obtained through the trans-Saharan trade, and gold adorned his person with a lavishness that was clearly intended not as personal vanity but as a statement of sovereign power. He moved through Cairo with the unhurried pace of a man who understood that his presence was itself a message, and that the message would be received whether he spoke or not. The message was simple, and it was devastating. I am here, I am real, and I am richer than you. The Mamluk court scrambled to respond. Protocol required that a visiting sovereign be received by the Sultan, and arrangements were made for Musa to be brought to the citadel, the massive fortress complex that dominated Cairo's skyline and served as the seat of Mamluk power. But here the first diplomatic awkwardness arose. An awkwardness that revealed the collision of 2 proud civilizations with very different assumptions about how power should be displayed and deferred to. Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad expected Musa to kiss the ground before him. This was standard Mamluk protocol for visiting dignitaries, a physical acknowledgement of the Sultan's supreme authority. Musa refused, not rudely, not with the bluster of a man spoiling for a confrontation. He refused with the quiet certainty of a man who considered himself an equal and who believed correctly by any objective measure of the territory, population, and wealth he commanded that he had no reason to prostrate himself before anyone but God. The impasse was resolved through a diplomatic formula that al-Umari recorded with evident admiration for its elegance. One of Musa's courtiers suggested that the Mansa could kiss the ground before God rather than before the Sultan, a theological distinction that allowed Musa to perform the physical gesture of obeisance while directing it toward the divine rather than the temporal authority in the room. Al-Nasir Muhammad accepted this compromise. Whether he was genuinely satisfied or simply recognized that pressing the point with a man who had arrived with 80 camels of gold was diplomatically unwise, the sources do not say. The meeting that followed was conducted with the elaborate formality that both courts demanded. Gifts were exchanged, pleasantries were offered, and then Musa did the thing that would define his legacy in Cairo forever. He began to give away gold, not as diplomatic gifts, which would have been expected and manageable, not in the carefully calibrated quantities that protocol prescribed. He gave it away the way a river floods, abundantly, indiscriminately, and with a force that no existing channel could contain. He gave gold to the Sultan. He gave gold to the Sultan's officials. He gave gold to the emirs who attended the court. He gave gold to the judges, the scholars, the religious functionaries. He gave gold to the merchants in the bazaar, to the servants who attended him, to the people he passed in the street. He gave gold to beggars. He gave gold to anyone who provided him a service, and the amounts he gave bore no relationship to the value of the service provided. A guide who showed him to a mosque might receive a sum that would have taken a skilled craftsman years to earn. A merchant who sold him a length of cloth might receive payment 10 or 20 times the cloth's value. Al-Umari's informants were precise about the scale. Musa's spending in Cairo was so enormous that it constituted a macroeconomic event. The influx of gold into the Egyptian economy was sudden, massive, and entirely unabsorbed by any existing mechanism of monetary management. The gold market, which had been stable for years, was overwhelmed. The value of gold in Egypt dropped by as much as 25%, and some sources say more in the space of weeks. This was not a temporary fluctuation. It was a structural devaluation that persisted for more than a decade. 12 years after Musa's visit, Al-Umari recorded that the gold market in Cairo had still not fully recovered. To understand the magnitude of this, consider what it means to crash a commodity market through generosity. The Mamluk Sultanate was not a fragile economy. It was one of the wealthiest states in the medieval world, with sophisticated financial institutions, established trade networks, and centuries of experience managing the flow of precious metals. And one man, passing through on a religious pilgrimage, had destabilized it, not through warfare, not through sanctions or blockades, through the act of giving. The merchants of Cairo, initially delighted by this unprecedented customer, began to realize the trap they had walked into. Every transaction with Musa or his entourage injected more gold into the local economy, driving down the value of the gold they had just received. They had sold goods at prices denominated in a currency that was losing value in real time because of the very transaction that had enriched them. The more Musa spent, the less each piece of gold was worth. And Musa showed no sign of stopping. There is a particular irony embedded in this catastrophe, and it is worth pausing to examine because it reveals something essential about Musa's character and worldview. He was not trying to destabilize anything. He was not engaged in economic warfare. He was simply fulfilling what he understood as a religious obligation, the duty of a wealthy Muslim to share his abundance, to give alms generously, to demonstrate through his actions that worldly wealth was a trust from God rather than a personal possession to be hoarded. In the context of his own empire, where the gold supply was carefully managed and where his generosity was absorbed by a population accustomed to the Mansa's largesse, this behavior was unremarkable. In Cairo, where the sudden injection of an unimaginable quantity of gold into a market that had not anticipated it, the same impulse became an economic weapon of devastating precision. Musa, in other words, broke the Egyptian economy not through malice or ignorance, but through a collision of scale. His wealth was so far beyond the Egyptian frame of reference that the normal rules of exchange simply did not apply. He was operating in a different economic universe, and when that universe briefly intersected with Cairo's, the result was chaos. The chaos extended beyond economics. The social fabric of Cairo was disrupted in subtler but equally significant ways. Al-Umari noted that Musa's entourage, which remained in Cairo for approximately 3 months, far longer than originally planned, partly due to the logistical challenges of organizing the onward journey to Mecca, and partly, some sources suggest, because Musa was waiting for the Nile's annual flood to recede, created a sustained demand for housing, food, and services that strained the city's capacity. 60,000 additional mouths to feed, 60,000 additional bodies to house. The markets were stripped of goods. Prices for food and basic commodities rose even as the value of gold fell. The combination was punishing for Cairo's ordinary residents, who found themselves paying more for bread while the currency they earned it in was worth less. Yet the sources also describe a genuine fascination that the people of Cairo developed for their visitors. The West Africans were exotic in the most literal sense, from outside the known world, from a place that most Egyptians associated with vague rumors and imprecise geography. Their clothing was different, their music was different, their languages were incomprehensible. Their physical appearance, darker skinned on average than the Arab and Turkic populations of Cairo, marked them as visibly distinct in a city that, while cosmopolitan, was accustomed to a particular range of human appearance. And yet they moved with an organization and a dignity that commanded respect. These were not refugees or supplicants. They were the representatives of a great power, and they conducted themselves accordingly. Musa himself appears to have been deeply affected by Cairo, though in ways that the sources only hint at. He was, after all, a man of considerable sophistication, the ruler of a complex empire with its own legal, religious, and administrative traditions. But Cairo represented something his own empire did not yet possess: the accumulated architectural, intellectual, and institutional weight of centuries of Islamic civilization at its most developed. The mosques of Cairo were grander than anything in Niani or Timbuktu. The madrasas were more established. The libraries were more extensive. The legal scholarship was more refined. Musa, for all his wealth, was encountering a civilization that had advantages his empire could not yet match. Not in gold, but in stone, in scholarship, in the infrastructure of knowledge. This recognition would shape everything he did after the pilgrimage. But that lay in the future. For now he had a more immediate concern. He was running out of gold. The statement seems absurd given the quantities he had brought, but 3 months of spending on the scale he had maintained, combined with the plummeting value of the gold he was dispensing, had created an unexpected crisis. Musa had given away so much gold in Cairo that he did not have enough to fund the onward journey to Mecca and the return trip home. The man who had crashed Egypt's economy through his generosity now found himself in the remarkable position of needing to borrow money. And borrow he did. Musa took out loans from Cairo's merchants at what Al-Umari described as exorbitant interest rates. The merchants, having just watched the value of their gold holdings plummet because of this man's profligacy, were not inclined toward generosity in their lending terms. They charged rates that reflected both the risk of lending to a foreign sovereign who was about to disappear into the Hejaz and the opportunity to recover some of the value his visit had cost them. Musa accepted the terms without complaint. He would repay the loans in full on his return journey through Cairo, and he did on time with the punctiliousness of a man who understood that his creditworthiness was a matter of sovereign honor. This detail, the borrowing, the repayment, the acceptance of harsh terms followed by scrupulous fulfillment of the obligation, is among the most revealing in the entire story. Where it demonstrates that Musa was not a naive spender who failed to understand the consequences of his generosity. He was a man who had chosen to spend lavishly in Cairo for specific reasons, religious, diplomatic, political, and who was willing to absorb the personal financial inconvenience that resulted. The borrowing was not a sign of failure. It was the price of a deliberate strategy. Musa had come to Cairo intending to make an impression that the Islamic world would never forget, and he had succeeded beyond anything the Mamluk court had ever witnessed. If the cost of that impression was a temporary cash flow problem and some unfavorable loan terms, so be it. The loans would be repaid. The impression would last forever. Al-Umari recorded one final detail about Musa's time in Cairo that deserves attention, because it reveals the cultural gulf that existed between the Mali Empire and the centers of the Islamic world, a gulf that Musa's wealth could bridge but not entirely close. During his stay, Musa was asked about the governance of his empire. He spoke through interpreters. His native language was Mandinka, and while he may have understood some Arabic, he did not speak it fluently enough for diplomatic conversation. He described the Mali Empire's system of provinces, its military organization, its legal traditions, and then he was asked about the succession, about how power was transmitted from one Mansa to the next. Musa's answer was straightforward. In the Mali Empire, the succession did not always pass from father to son. It could pass to brothers, to nephews, to members of the broader royal clan, depending on a complex set of criteria that weighed competence, political support, and the deliberations of senior court officials. This system, common in many West African states and designed to prevent the kind of dynastic weakness that resulted from automatically crowning an incompetent firstborn heirs, was alien to the Arab and Turkic political traditions of Cairo, where dynastic succession followed more predictable patrilineal lines. The Mamluk officials listened politely, but Al-Umari, recording their reactions years later, noted a tone of condescension, a subtle but unmistakable assumption that the Mali system was less sophisticated, less developed, somehow more primitive than the systems these men understood. This condescension persisted even in the face of the overwhelming evidence of Musa's wealth and organizational capacity. It was a preview of a pattern that would repeat for centuries. The refusal of the Arab and later European worlds to extend to sub-Saharan African civilizations the same respect they granted to states that were, by any objective measure, less wealthy, less stable, and less effectively governed. Musa appears to have been aware of this condescension. The sources do not record an anger, they record something closer to patience. The patience of a man who understood that the gold he had distributed through Cairo's streets would do more to shift perceptions than any argument, and who was willing to let the gold speak for itself. The gold spoke. It was still speaking 12 years later when Al-Umari arrived. It would still be speaking 7 centuries after that. Eventually, the preparations were complete, the logistics arranged, the caravan reassembled. Musa left Cairo and continued eastward, crossing the Sinai into the Hejaz, following the ancient pilgrim roads toward the holy cities. The journey from Cairo to Mecca was approximately 800 miles, a fraction of the total distance Musa had already covered, but through terrain that was no less harsh. The Arabian desert offered the same punishing heat, the same scarcity of water, the same crushing emptiness that the Sahara had imposed, but the road was better traveled. The infrastructure of the Hajj was well established, and Musa's caravan, diminished in its gold reserves but still enormous in its scale, moved through the Hejaz with the momentum of a force that had crossed worse and survived. What Musa experienced in Mecca itself is largely unrecorded in the detail one might wish for. The Hajj is, by its nature, a private spiritual experience embedded within a collective ritual, and the sources are more interested in the political and economic dimensions of Musa's journey than in his interior life. But certain things can be inferred from what followed. The Hajj was the original purpose of the journey. Everything else, the spectacle in Cairo, the diplomatic encounters, the economic disruption, was secondary to the act of fulfilling the 5th pillar of Islam. Musa had traveled 4,000 miles, spent a fortune, crossed the most forbidding landscapes on the planet, and subjected 60,000 people to months of hardship because his faith required him to stand at Arafat, to circle the Kaaba, to perform the ancient rituals that connected him to every Muslim who had ever lived and every Muslim who ever would. Or whatever else Musa was, emperor, diplomat, economic force of nature, he was, at his core, a believer. And in Mecca, stripped of the political dynamics that had complicated his time in Cairo, he was simply a pilgrim among pilgrims, performing the same acts of devotion that the poorest Muslim in the crowd performed beside him. This is the paradox at the heart of the Hajj, and Musa embodied it with a completeness that bordered on the absurd. The pilgrimage is designed to erase distinctions of wealth, of status, of nationality, and to remind every Muslim of their equality before God. Musa arrived at this ritual of equality with the largest and most opulent entourage in recorded Hajj history. He arrived as a man whose very presence had destabilized a foreign economy. He arrived carrying, even after Cairo's depletions, more gold than most of his fellow pilgrims would see in 1,000 lifetimes, and he was there to be reminded that none of it mattered. Whether the lesson took hold in the way Orthodox theology intended is impossible to say, but something happened to Musa in the Hejaz. Something shifted. The man who returned to Cairo on his way home was, by several accounts, subtly different from the man who had passed through months earlier. He was more focused. The indiscriminate generosity of the outward journey was replaced by a more directed kind of ambition. In Cairo, on his return passage, Musa did something that the initial visit had not included. He recruited. He hired architects, scholars, and artisans, men of specialized skill, whom he intended to bring back to the Mali Empire to transform its cities, its institutions, and its relationship to the broader Islamic world. The most significant of these recruits was a man named Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Sahili, an architect and poet from Granada, in Muslim Spain, whom Musa encountered either in Mecca or in Cairo, as far as the sources differ, and whom he persuaded to accompany him back to West Africa. Al-Sahili was not merely an architect, he was a product of Andalusian Islamic civilization at its most refined, a culture that had produced the Alhambra, the Great Mosque of Cordoba, and some of the most sophisticated architectural achievements in human history. He brought with him not just technical skill, but an entire aesthetic tradition, a way of conceiving the relationship between space, all light, and divine purpose that would transform the built environment of the Mali Empire. His fee for making the journey, according to the sources, was 200 mithqals of gold, a sum so large that it underscored both the value Musa placed on his expertise and the scale of ambition that now drove the Mansa's vision. Musa also recruited scholars of Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and science. He purchased books, manuscripts of Quranic commentary, legal texts, works of philosophy and astronomy, in quantities that suggested he was building not merely a personal library, but the foundation of an intellectual infrastructure. He arranged for the establishment of ongoing scholarly exchanges between the Mali Empire and the centers of Islamic learning in Cairo and the Hejaz. The man who had arrived in Cairo as a spectacular enigma, a fabulously wealthy stranger from a barely known land, was leaving as something more deliberate. He was leaving as a sovereign with a plan. He had seen what the Islamic world's greatest cities looked like, how their institutions functioned, what their scholars knew, and he intended to build the same in his own land. Not as imitation, as incorporation. He would take what he had seen and fuse it with what his empire already possessed, and the result would be something the world had not yet seen. The return journey across the Sahara was, by all indications, less eventful than the outward crossing. The logistics were established, the route was known, Mir and the caravan, Bayites now augmented by al-Sahili and the other recruits, retraced its steps across the desert with the practiced efficiency of an organization that had already accomplished the feat once. There were losses, inevitably. The Sahara did not suspend its cruelty for returning pilgrims any more than it had for departing ones. People died of heat, of thirst, of the simple accumulated exhaustion of months of travel through landscapes that were hostile to human survival. The sources do not record the number of dead. They rarely do. The 60,000 who departed Niani did not all return to Niani, and the names of those who fell in the sand were not preserved by the chroniclers who recorded the names of kings. But Musa returned, sometime in 1325, and after a journey that had consumed the better part of 2 years and covered approximately 8,000 miles round trip, the Mansa of Mali re-entered his capital at Niani with his entourage, his recruits, his manuscripts, and a vision for what his empire would become. Behind him, Cairo was still counting the cost. Ahead of him, the cities of the Mali Empire were about to be transformed in ways that would echo for centuries, and across the Mediterranean, in the chanceries and cartography workshops of Christian Europe, a name that had been completely unknown 18 months earlier was beginning to appear in conversations, in letters, in the margins of half-finished maps. Mansa Musa, the Lion of Mali, the king who had so much gold he had broken Egypt with his charity. The world was beginning to pay attention. The transformation began almost immediately. Musa returned to an empire that was, by any external measure, already extraordinary. The Mali Empire in the mid-1320s was the largest political entity in Africa, one of the largest on earth, and almost certainly the wealthiest. Its trade network spanned thousands of miles. Its armies could field tens of thousands of soldiers. Its administrative systems governed millions of people across a territory of staggering diversity. By the standards of the age, by the standards of any age, it was a formidable achievement. But Musa had seen Cairo. He had seen the Hejaz. He had walked through cities where the relationship between faith and architecture, between learning and power, between the individual soul and the collective civilization was expressed in stone, in light, in institutions that had endured for centuries and showed every sign of enduring for centuries more. He had seen what permanence looked like, and he understood with the clarity that only direct comparison can provide that his empire, for all its wealth, for all its military reach, had not yet built the physical and intellectual infrastructure that would allow it to outlast the dynasty that created it. Gold was power, but gold was also temporary. It could be spent, stolen, lost, devalued. What could not be easily destroyed was a mosque that anchored a community's identity, a madrasa that trained generation after generation of scholars and administrators, a city whose very layout expressed a civilization's understanding of order and beauty. Musa had seen these things in Cairo, and he intended to create them in Mali. Al-Sahili, the Andalusian architect, was the instrument of this ambition, and the canvas on which he would work was Timbuktu. Timbuktu in the 1320s was already a significant city, but it had not yet become the legend it would later be. It sat at the northern edge of the Niger River's Great Bend, at the precise point where the river came closest to the southern fringes of the Sahara, a geographical accident that gave the city an almost supernatural strategic importance. It was the hinge between two worlds. Caravans coming south across the desert reached Timbuktu before they reached any other major settlement on the Niger. Boats traveling up or down the river could reach Timbuktu more easily than any other city with direct access to the trans-Saharan routes. The city was, in effect, a valve controlling the flow of goods between the Saharan trade system and the Niger River trade system, and whoever held Timbuktu held the switch that connected West Africa's interior to the wider world. The city had been founded, according to tradition, by Tuareg nomads sometime around the 11th or 12th century. A seasonal camp that gradually became permanent as its commercial advantages became apparent. By the time the Mali Empire absorbed it, probably during the reign of Mansa Wali in the late 13th century, it was already a thriving trading center. But its buildings were modest, its mosques were functional rather than grand, its reputation, while growing, had not yet reached the mythic proportions that would later make its very name a synonym for remoteness and mystery in European languages. Musa changed that. Upon his return from the Hajj, he commissioned Al-Sahili to design and build a new royal palace in Timbuktu, the Madagu, as the sources call it, and, more importantly, to redesign the city's central mosque. The result was the Jingwarabur Mosque, which still stands today nearly 700 years later. its distinctive Sudano-Sahelian architecture recognizable in photographs that have circled the world. Al-Sahili did not simply transplant Andalusian or Egyptian forms onto West African soil. He created something new, a fusion of the burnt brick construction techniques he had brought from the Islamic heartlands with the local building traditions of the Western Sudan, which relied heavily on banko, a mixture of mud, straw, and other organic materials that could be shaped into the fluid, organic forms that characterize Sahelian architecture. The Djinguereber Mosque's thick earthen walls, its conical minarets studded with projecting wooden beams called toron, its spacious interior courtyard, these were neither purely Andalusian nor purely Malayan. They were the architectural expression of an empire that was becoming something the world had not seen before, an African state that had absorbed the best of Islamic civilization and reshaped it according to its own aesthetic and spiritual sensibility. Al-Sahili was rewarded handsomely. The sources speak of 12,000 mithqals of gold dust, a fortune by any standard, plus land, slaves, and the ongoing patronage of the Mansa. He settled permanently in the Mali Empire, apparently never returning to Granada, and spent the remainder of his life designing buildings across Musa's domain. He is credited with introducing fired brick construction to the region, a technology that allowed for larger, more durable structures than the traditional banko alone could support. His influence extended beyond individual buildings to the very concept of what a West African city could look like, how it could organize space, how it could express through its physical form the power and sophistication of the civilization that built it. But Musa's building program extended far beyond Timbuktu and far beyond the work of a single architect, however gifted. He commissioned mosques in virtually every major city and town across his empire. Ibn Khaldun recorded that Musa built mosques wherever he stopped for Friday prayers during his return journey across his own territories, a tradition that, if accurate, would have left a trail of sacred architecture stretching from the Saharan frontier to the capital at Niani. The sources speak of mosques at Gao, at Jenne, at Niani itself, and at numerous smaller settlements whose names have not survived. Each one served a dual purpose as a house of worship, anchoring the community's spiritual life, and as a visible marker of Musa's sovereignty and his empire's commitment to Islam. The madrasa construction was in some ways even more consequential. Musa established or expanded institutions of Islamic learning across the empire, importing scholars from Egypt, Morocco, and the Hejaz to staff them and purchasing manuscripts to fill their libraries. The most famous of these institutions was the Sankore Mosque and its associated university in Timbuktu, which would grow over the following century into one of the great centers of learning in the Islamic world. The scholars at Sankore and its sister institutions studied and taught the full range of Islamic sciences, Quranic exegesis, hadith, jurisprudence, logic, rhetoric, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. And they produced a body of written scholarship in Arabic that has only begun to be fully cataloged and studied in the modern era. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are among the most important and least appreciated intellectual treasures on earth. Hundreds of thousands of them survive. Some estimate the total at over 700,000 warrens in private family collections, in the libraries of Timbuktu's old scholarly families, and in repositories established by modern preservation efforts. They cover subjects ranging from theology and law to astronomy, medicine, mathematics, chemistry, and philosophy. They include original treatises, commentaries on classical Islamic texts, correspondence between scholars across the Muslim world, and legal opinions on matters of trade, governance, and social relations. Many of them date from the centuries immediately following Musa's reign, the direct intellectual descendants of the scholarly infrastructure he established. These manuscripts matter not merely as historical artifacts, but as evidence that directly contradicts one of the most persistent and pernicious myths in Western historiography: the claim that sub-Saharan Africa produced no written intellectual tradition, no literature, no scholarship worthy of comparison with the achievements of other civilizations. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are that tradition. They are the physical, tangible, readable proof that West Africa participated fully in the intellectual life of the medieval and early modern Islamic world, producing scholars who corresponded with their peers in Cairo and Fez and Mecca as equals, and who made original contributions to fields that European scholars of the same period would have recognized as legitimate branches of knowledge. Musa did not create this tradition single-handedly. The roots of Islamic scholarship in West Africa predated his reign by centuries, but he fertilized it with resources on a scale that no previous Mansa had attempted. He provided the funding, the infrastructure, the imported expertise, and, perhaps most importantly, the political prestige that attracted scholars from across the Muslim world to a region they might otherwise have considered too remote to bother with. He made Timbuktu fashionable. He made it a destination not just for merchants seeking gold, but for intellectuals seeking knowledge, for poets seeking patronage, for architects seeking commissions, for anyone in the Islamic world who understood that wealth and power were flowing toward the Western Sudan and who wanted to be part of what was being built there. Economies. The result was a cultural efflorescence that would reach its full flowering in the 15th and 16th centuries after Musa's death, but whose roots were sunk deep into the soil of his reign. When the Moroccan scholar Leo Africanus visited Timbuktu in the early 16th century, he described a city where books were the most valuable commodity in the market, more prized than gold, more sought after than salt. The manuscripts sold for such high prices, he reported, that the book trade generated more profit than any other commercial activity in the city. This was the world Musa had seeded. 2 centuries after his death, the intellectual infrastructure he had built was still producing returns. Yet the building program and the scholarly patronage, for all their lasting significance, were only part of what Musa accomplished after the Hajj. He also turned his attention to the political and administrative structure of his empire, refining the systems that held this vast, diverse, multilingual domain together. The Mali Empire's administrative system was, by the standards of any medieval state, remarkably effective. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a pharaon or Diamani Tigui, a provincial governor who reported to the Mansa and was responsible for maintaining order, collecting tribute, and providing soldiers when called upon. These governors were sometimes members of the royal Keita clan, sometimes members of allied families, and sometimes men of ability who had been elevated to their positions through merit rather than birth. The system allowed for considerable local variation. Governors adapted their methods to the customs and needs of the populations they administered, while maintaining a clear chain of authority that terminated in the Mansa's person. Beneath the governors, the empire relied on a dense network of local leaders, village chiefs, clan elders, religious authorities, who managed the day-to-day affairs of their communities and served as intermediaries between the central government and the population. The system was not unlike the feudal arrangements of contemporary Europe, but with significant differences. The role of the griot was one. These hereditary oral historians and counselors served not merely as entertainers, but as constitutional authorities, living repositories of the laws, genealogies, and precedents that governed the relationships between the empire's constituent groups. A griot could settle a land dispute by reciting the relevant provisions of the Mandan Charter. A griot could legitimate or delegitimate a claim to power by confirming or denying a claimant's genealogical credentials. In a society where the law was oral rather than written, the griots were the law. Musa's refinements to this system were aimed at strengthening central authority while maintaining the flexibility that allowed the empire to accommodate its extraordinary diversity. He appointed loyal followers to key provincial governorships, replacing men whose loyalties were uncertain with men who owed their positions entirely to him. He expanded the empire's diplomatic corps, on sending ambassadors not just to the Mamluk Sultanate, but to the Marinid dynasty in Morocco, to the Hafsid dynasty in Tunisia, and to other Muslim states with which he wished to establish or strengthen relationships. He standardized certain aspects of trade regulation, ensuring that the empire's taxation system, which extracted tribute in gold, salt, and other commodities from the provinces and channeled it toward the capital, functioned with minimal corruption and maximum efficiency. The military remained the ultimate guarantor of the system. The Mali Empire's army was large, professional, and organized along lines that would have been familiar to any contemporary military power. Ibn Khaldun estimated the empire's total military strength at approximately 100,000 soldiers, though this figure likely included both the standing army and the reserves that could be mobilized from the provinces in times of crisis. The core of the army consisted of cavalry, mounted warriors equipped with spears, swords, and bows, riding horses that were among the most valued possessions in West African society. Horses did not breed well in the tsetse fly zones of the southern savannah, and importing them from North Africa across the Sahara was expensive, so a large cavalry force was itself a marker of immense wealth. The infantry included archers, spearmen, and specialized units, and the army was supported by a logistics system capable of sustaining extended campaigns across the empire's vast territory. Musa used this military force judiciously, unlike some of his predecessors, who had expanded the empire through aggressive conquest. Musa appears to have focused more on consolidation than expansion, though he did extend the empire's borders in certain directions. The most significant military action of his reign was the conquest, or reconquest, of the city of Gao, the capital of the Songhai people on the eastern Niger. Gao was a crucial trading center, and bringing it firmly under Malian control extended the empire's reach eastward and secured an additional node in the trans-Saharan trade network. Musa garrisoned the city and characteristically built a mosque there to mark his sovereignty. He also brought the key Saharan trading centers of Timbuktu and Walata more firmly under central control, appointing governors from his own court rather than relying on the local Tuareg and Berber leaders who had previously managed these cities with varying degrees of autonomy. This was a politically sensitive move. The Tuareg in particular were proud, independent-minded people who did not easily accept the authority of the Mandinka emperors. But Musa backed it with sufficient military force and economic incentive to make resistance unattractive. The net effect of these political and military actions was to create, by the late 1320s and into the 1330s, an empire that was more centralized, more administratively coherent, and more firmly connected to the broader Islamic world than it had ever been. Musa's Hajj had announced the Mali Empire to the world. His post-Hajj reforms ensured that the empire was prepared for the world's attention. And the world was paying attention. The consequences of Musa's pilgrimage radiated outward in concentric rings, reaching places and peoples that Musa himself would never visit, reshaping the mental geography of civilizations that had previously given no thought to the interior of West Africa. The most famous and visually striking evidence of this impact is the Catalan Atlas, produced in 1375 by the Majorcan cartographer Abraham Cresques. The Catalan Atlas was one of the most important maps of the medieval world, a massive, lavishly illustrated work commissioned by King Charles V of France and intended to represent the sum of contemporary geographical knowledge. It depicted the known world from the Atlantic to China, incorporating information from Arab geographers, European travelers, merchant reports, and diplomatic intelligence. It was the Google Earth of its age, incomplete, imperfect, but representing the best available understanding of the planet's geography. And there, in the interior of West Africa, sat Mansa Musa. He is depicted as a crowned figure seated on a golden throne, holding a large gold nugget in one hand and a golden scepter in the other. He wears a European-style crown, an artistic convention, since Cresques had no idea what a Malian sovereign actually looked like, and his skin is dark. A text beside the image, written in Catalan, identifies him and describes his kingdom in terms that leave no ambiguity about the impression his Hajj had made on the European imagination. Even half a century after the event, the inscription speaks of a lord so rich that he was the wealthiest and most noble king in all the land. My, this is extraordinary. Consider what it means. A European cartographer working on the island of Majorca in 1375, more than 50 years after Musa's pilgrimage, considered the emperor of Mali to be important enough to include, prominently, centrally, on the most prestigious map of the age. Musa is the only sub-Saharan African ruler depicted on the atlas. He is given visual prominence comparable to that of European monarchs. The cartographer, who had access to the best available intelligence from across the Mediterranean world, had concluded that this African emperor was among the most significant political figures on the planet. The Catalan Atlas was not the only European map to feature Musa. The Mecca de Viladestes map of 1413 includes a similar depiction. In the Italian Angelino Dolcert's Portolan chart of 1339, produced only 15 years after the Hajj, shows a Rex Melli in the West African interior, evidence that news of Musa's journey had reached European cartographic circles within barely a decade. Each of these maps represented a fundamental revision of how Europe understood the geography of wealth and power. Before Musa's Hajj, European maps of West Africa were blank or filled with the generic monsters and exotica that cartographers used to disguise their ignorance. After the Hajj, they showed a kingdom, a sovereign, gold. This cartographic revolution had practical consequences. The maps of the 14th and 15th centuries did not merely describe the world, they guided ambition. They told merchants, monarchs, and adventurers where wealth was concentrated and how it might be accessed. When European explorers began probing the West African coast in the 15th century, the Portuguese creeping southward along the Atlantic shore, driven by a hunger for gold that their Mediterranean trade networks could not fully satisfy, they were, in a very real sense, following the maps that Musa's Hajj had drawn for them. The gold of Guinea, which the Portuguese spent decades trying to access directly, was the same gold that Musa had carried to Cairo. The image of the African sovereign on his golden throne, seared into the European imagination by the Catalan Atlas and its successors, was the lure that pulled European ships further and further down the African coast, a process that would eventually lead, by catastrophic and winding paths, into the Atlantic slave trade, to colonialism, and to the modern world. This is one of the deepest ironies of Musa's legacy, and it must be named plainly. The man who announced Africa's wealth to the world also inadvertently painted a target on the continent's back. The very magnificence that earned him a place on European maps ensured that European powers would spend the following centuries trying to control the sources of that magnificence. Musa could not have foreseen this. No one could have. But the chain of causation, from his Hajj to the maps, from the maps to the voyages, from the voyages to colonialisms, is traceable, and any honest accounting of his historical significance must include it. Within the Islamic world, the impact was different in character, but no less profound. Musa's Hajj had demonstrated that the Western Sudan was not a peripheral backwater, but a center of wealth and power that demanded serious attention. Arab and North African scholars began paying closer attention to West Africa, incorporating it more fully into their geographical and historical works. The trans-Saharan trade routes, always important, became even more heavily trafficked as merchants from the north sought to tap directly into the gold sources that Musa had so spectacularly advertised. Diplomatic relationships between the Mali Empire and the major Muslim states intensified, with ambassadors traveling in both directions and the exchange of gifts, scholars, and manuscripts becoming routine. The economic impact on Egypt specifically remained a subject of conversation for decades. Al-Umari, writing 12 years after the Hajj, he found that the gold market in Cairo was still depressed. The merchants he interviewed still spoke of Musa's visit with a mixture of awe and economic resentment. The sheer volume of gold he had injected into the Egyptian economy had created what modern economists would recognize as demand-pull inflation. Too much money chasing too few good coins, compounded by the devaluation of gold itself relative to other stores of value. The recovery was slow, hampered by the structural nature of the disruption. Musa had not merely flooded the market with a one-time surplus, he had fundamentally altered the Egyptian gold supply in a way that required years of natural market adjustment to correct. Some scholars have pointed out that Musa appears to have recognized this problem during his return journey through Cairo and attempted to mitigate it. Al-Umari records that on his return passage, Musa borrowed gold back from Cairo's merchants, effectively reversing to some degree the flow he had initiated on his outbound journey. Whether this was a deliberate attempt at monetary stabilization or simply a practical response to his own depleted funds is debated. But the effect was the same. By borrowing gold in Cairo, Musa was withdrawing some of the excess liquidity he had pumped into the economy months earlier, providing a partial correction to the inflationary pressure his generosity had created. If this was deliberate, and some scholars believe it was, it represents one of the earliest documented instances of a sovereign actor attempting to manage the macroeconomic consequences of a monetary shock. Musa would have had no formal training in what we now call economics, but he ruled an empire whose prosperity depended on managing the flow of gold with extraordinary precision, controlling how much entered the market, ensuring that supply never overwhelmed demand, maintaining the value of the commodity that underpinned his entire economy. The skills required to manage the Mali Empire's gold trade were, in essence, the skills of a central banker. It is not implausible that Musa applied those skills in Cairo, recognizing that the economic disruption he had caused was damaging to his own reputation and diplomatic interests, and taking steps to ameliorate it. Whether deliberate or not, the borrowing was effective. Musa repaid his debts. The Egyptian gold market eventually stabilized, and the long-term diplomatic relationship between Mali and the Mamluk Sultanate was strengthened rather than damaged by the episode. The Mamluks, whatever their private feelings about the economic chaos Musa had wrought, recognized that maintaining good relations with the ruler who controlled the headwaters of the global gold supply was in their interest. Musa, for his part, continued to cultivate the relationship, sending ambassadors and gifts to Cairo in the years following his return. Back in his own empire, Musa's prestige was at its zenith. The Hajj had accomplished everything he could have hoped for and more. He had fulfilled his religious obligation. He had announced his empire to the Islamic world and through it to Christendom. He had recruited the architects, scholars, and artisans who would transform his cities. He had established diplomatic relationships that would serve his empire for generations, and he had done something that no amount of military conquest could have achieved. He had made the Mali Empire famous. Fame, in the medieval world, was not a trivial commodity. It attracted trade, it attracted scholars, it attracted skilled immigrants, it deterred potential enemies who thought twice before challenging a sovereign whose wealth and power were the subject of conversation from Cairo to Cordoba. Fame was, in a very real sense, a form of strategic capital, and Musa had accumulated more of it in a single journey than most sovereigns accumulated in a lifetime. The years following the Hajj, roughly the late 1320s through the 1330s, represented the high watermark of the Mali Empire's power and cultural achievement. The building program was in full swing. The scholarly institutions were growing. The trade networks were functioning at peak efficiency. The empire's borders were secure. The Mansa's authority was unchallenged. Al-Umari, collecting his information in Cairo in the mid-1330s, described an empire of formidable extent and sophistication, a state that managed its diverse population with a combination of military strength, economic incentive, and religious authority that commanded the respect of every informed observer in the Islamic world. Ibn Battuta's account, though it describes the court of Musa's successor rather than Musa himself, preserves details of the administrative and ceremonial systems that Musa had refined. The Moroccan traveler described elaborate court ceremonies in which the Mansa sat on a raised platform under a silk canopy, attended by officials carrying gold and silver instruments of authority. Petitioners approached on their knees, sprinkling dust on their heads as a sign of respect. Griots sang the praises of the ruler and recited the genealogies of the dynasty. Musicians played instruments whose sounds Ibn Battuta found alien, but whose discipline he acknowledged. The court functioned with a precision and a formality that impressed even a man who had visited the courts of the Delhi Sultanate, the Byzantine Empire, and the Golden Horde. Ibn Battuta was not uncritical. he found certain Malian customs, the practice of female servants and slaves appearing without clothing, certain pre-Islamic religious practices that coexisted with Islam, the degree of social freedom accorded to women, shocking by the standards of his own Moroccan Islamic culture. His disapproval was often palpable, and his account must be read with an awareness that his judgments were filtered through his own cultural biases. But his criticisms, in a sense, are as valuable as his praise because they reveal the Mali Empire's characteristic refusal to conform entirely to the norms of the Islamic heartlands. Musa had embraced Islam deeply and sincerely, but neither he nor his subjects had abandoned their indigenous cultural traditions. The result was a civilization that was recognizably Islamic, but also recognizably and distinctly African. A synthesis that the more rigid theologians of Cairo or Fez might have found uncomfortable, but that worked in practice with remarkable effectiveness. This synthesis was perhaps Musa's most significant achievement, more significant than the Hajj, more lasting than the gold, and more important than any individual building or institution. He demonstrated that a sub-Saharan African civilization could engage fully with the global Islamic world, adopting its religion, its scholarly traditions, its architectural forms, its diplomatic protocols, without surrendering its own identity. He proved that integration did not require assimilation, that wealth and sophistication were compatible with cultural distinctiveness, that an empire built on the savanna of West Africa could stand as an equal among the great civilizations of the age without pretending to be something it was not. The griots understood this. The praise songs they composed for Musa, transmitted across generations, and are refined and elaborated with each retelling, celebrated him not merely as a wealthy king or a pious pilgrim, but as a figure who had elevated the Mande peoples in the estimation of the world. He had gone out into the wider world, and the wider world had been forced to acknowledge what the griots had always known, that the land between the rivers was not a margin, it was a center, and the man who ruled it was not a curiosity, he was a peer. Musa ruled for approximately 25 years, though the exact dates of his reign are debated. Most scholars place his accession around 1312, and his death around 1337, though dates as late as 1341 have been proposed. The cause of his death is unknown. The circumstances surrounding it are unrecorded. He simply vanishes from the sources, replaced by his son Mansa Musa, whose reign was brief and undistinguished, followed by Musa's brother Mansa Suleiman, who ruled for approximately 20 years, and whose court was the one Ibn Battuta visited in 1352. The silence surrounding Musa's death is itself revealing. The sources that documented his life in such vivid detail, Al-Umari's interviews, Ibn Khaldun's genealogies, the griot traditions, have almost nothing to say about his final years. There are no accounts of a prolonged illness, no descriptions of a deathbed scene, no record of last words or final instructions. The man who had made the most spectacular public appearance in medieval history departed it in near total privacy. What he left behind was an empire at its peak, and a dynasty that would prove unequal to the task of maintaining it. The decline did not arrive as a single catastrophic event. It arrived the way most imperial collapses arrive, gradually, then suddenly, in a sequence of accumulating failures that would have been individually manageable, but that, taken together, proved fatal. The Mali Empire after Musa was like a magnificent building whose architect had died before teaching anyone else how to maintain the foundations. The walls still stood, the rooms still gleamed, but the cracks were spreading where no one thought to look. Mansa Musa, Musa's son, inherited the throne, and almost immediately demonstrated why the Mali succession system, with its emphasis on competence over primogeniture, existed in the first place. The sources are sparse on Magahan's reign, but what they record is not flattering. He appears to have lacked his father's combination of political shrewdness, religious authority, and personal charisma. The intangible qualities that had allowed Musa to hold a vast, diverse empire together through force of personality as much as force of arms. Magan ruled for approximately 4 years before being succeeded by Musa's brother, Mansa Suleiman, who proved more capable, but who faced challenges that even his brother at the height of his powers might have struggled to contain. The fundamental problem was structural, and it was the same problem that plagued every large pre-modern empire from Rome to the Mongol Khanates. The tension between centralized authority and the centrifugal pull of distant provinces whose local rulers had their own ambitions, their own armies, and their own reasons to resent the flow of tribute toward a distant capital. Musa had managed this tension through a combination of personal prestige, military deterrence, and the sheer economic incentive of participation in the empire's trade networks. But personal prestige dies with the person who earned it. Military deterrence requires constant investment and renewal, and economic incentives can be undermined by shifts in trade routes, changes in commodity prices, or the emergence of competing commercial centers. All three of these erosive forces were at work in the decades following Musa's death. The Songhai people of Gao, the eastern city that Musa had conquered and garrisoned, were among the first to test the empire's weakening grip. The Songhai had never fully accepted Malian overlordship. They were a proud, militarily capable people with their own cultural traditions and their own ambitions for regional dominance. Under Musa, they had been held in check by the Mansa's overwhelming military and economic superiority. Under his less formidable successors, they began to pull away. The Songhai princes who had been sent to Niani as hostages, a common practice in the Mali imperial system designed to ensure the loyalty of vassal rulers by holding their heirs at the capital, escaped and returned to Gao, where they began rebuilding Songhai military power and asserting increasing independence. This was not yet a rebellion. It was something more insidious, a slow withdrawal of cooperation, a gradual reassertion of local authority, a testing of limits that, when met with inadequate resistance, encouraged further testing. The Songhai stopped sending tribute, then they stopped acknowledging Malian governors. Then they began raiding Malian-controlled territories on their borders. Each step was small enough to avoid provoking a decisive military response, and each step left unchecked made the next step easier. The Tuareg, those fiercely independent Saharan nomads who had always chafed under Malian rule, were similarly restive. The Tuareg controlled the desert approaches to the empire's northern trading cities, and their cooperation was essential to the smooth functioning of the trans-Saharan trade. Under Musa, they had been kept in line through a combination of military garrisons and economic partnership. They were allowed to profit handsomely from the caravan trade as long as they acknowledged Malian sovereignty and kept the routes secure. But Tuareg loyalty was always conditional, and always contingent on the Malian state being strong enough to enforce its authority. As that strength waned, Tuareg raiding increased, and the trade routes that were the empire's economic lifeblood became less secure, less profitable, and less reliable. The Mossi kingdoms to the south and east, the Wolof states to the west, the various Fulani groups on the empire's northern margins, all of these polities had their own dynamics, their own trajectories of growth and assertiveness, and all of them sensed the weakening of the hand that had held them in check. The Mali Empire was not collapsing. Not yet. But it was contracting, pulling back from its furthest extensions like a tide going out, revealing the rocky foundations that the water had concealed. Mansa Suleiman managed to slow this process. Ibn Battuta, who visited his court in 1352, described a ruler who maintained the empire's ceremonial grandeur and who governed with evident competence. But Ibn Battuta also recorded signs of internal tension that would have been unthinkable under Musa. A palace conspiracy, involving one of Suleiman's wives and several senior courtiers, nearly toppled the Mansa. The conspiracy was suppressed, but its very existence spoke to a court where the bonds of loyalty that Musa had forged were fraying. When Suleiman died around 1360, the succession was contested violently, and the resulting civil strife consumed the empire's energy and attention at precisely the moment when its external challengers were growing bolder. The The civil wars of the late 14th century were the wound from which the Mali Empire would never fully recover. Multiple claimants to the throne fought for control. Each claimant drew support from different factions within the empire. Different provinces, different clans, different ethnic groups whose cooperation had been the foundation of Malian power. The wars shattered the illusion of unity. They revealed that the empire was, beneath the surface of Musa's carefully constructed order, a coalition of interests that had been held together by the gravitational pull of a dominant center. When the center weakened, the coalition began to fly apart. By the early 15th century, the empire had lost control of Timbuktu. The Tuaregs seized the city around 1433, expelling the Malian governor and establishing their own authority over the commercial hub that Musa had transformed. The loss of Timbuktu was both strategically devastating and symbolically crushing. This was the city where Musa had built the Jingareber Mosque, where al-Sahili had introduced his revolutionary architectural forms, where the scholarly institutions that Musa had funded were producing some of the finest intellectual work in the Islamic world. It was in many ways the crown jewel of Musa's legacy, and it was gone. Gao followed. The Songhai, who had been slowly building their strength for decades, emerged as a fully independent power under a series of capable rulers, and by the mid-15th century they had reversed the relationship entirely. It was the Songhai who were expanding at Mali's expense, not the other way around. The rise of the Songhai Empire, which would eventually eclipse Mali as the dominant power in the Western Sudan, was the ultimate irony of Musa's conquest of Gao. He had brought the Songhai into his empire's orbit, exposed them to the administrative and military techniques of the Malayan state, and given their princes a first-hand education in how a great empire functioned. They had learned their lessons well, too well, from the Malian perspective. The Mali Empire did not disappear overnight. It lingered for centuries, shrinking gradually from a continental power to a regional one, from a regional power to a local one, until by the 17th century it existed as little more than a small Mandinka chiefdom in the upper Niger Valley, a relic of a grandeur that had become the stuff of oral tradition and fading memory. The Keita dynasty endured, or remarkably, descendants of Sundiata's line continued to hold authority in the Mandinka heartlands well into the colonial period, a dynastic continuity spanning more than 5 centuries. But the empire they had built, the empire Musa had brought to its zenith, was gone. The causes of the decline have been debated by scholars for decades, and the truth is that no single factor explains it. Imperial overextension played a role. The empire was simply too large, too diverse, and too dependent on the personal authority of the Mansa to survive an extended period of weak leadership. The shift in trade routes contributed. As the Portuguese began establishing direct maritime contact with West African gold sources in the 15th century, the trans-Saharan routes that had enriched Mali lost some of their strategic importance, and the economic leverage that had been the empire's most powerful tool diminished. Environmental factors may have played a part: shifts in rainfall patterns, changes in the Niger River's behavior, the gradual southward advance of the Sahara Desert. Political factors were clearly central: the succession crises, the civil wars, the inability of Musa's successors to reproduce the combination of wealth, piety, military power, and personal charisma that had made his reign possible. But perhaps the deepest cause was the most fundamental. The Mali Empire was, like all great empires, a human creation, and human creations are mortal. The institutions Musa built were impressive, but they were not self-sustaining. They required constant renewal, constant investment, constant attention from a center that was itself subject to the accidents of birth, death, and dynastic politics. The mosques needed maintenance, or the madrasas needed funding. The trade networks needed protection. The army needed paying. The governors needed supervising. And when the man who had done all of these things with such apparent effortlessness was gone, the effort they required became visible and overwhelming. This is the tragedy of empire, and it is not unique to Mali. Rome fell, The Abbasids fell, the Mongols fell, the Ottomans fell. Every great imperial project in human history has followed the same arc: rise, zenith, decline, and either transformation or dissolution. The Mali Empire was not exempt from this pattern, and expecting it to have been, holding it to a standard of permanence that no other civilization has achieved, would be both historically illiterate and, in a subtler way, a form of the same condescension that the Mamluk officials displayed toward Musa in Cairo. The Mali Empire lasted approximately 3 centuries as a major power. This is comparable to the lifespan of the Ottoman Empire, longer than the Mongol Empire, and vastly longer than most European colonial empires. By any reasonable standard, it was a remarkable achievement. But the decline matters to Musa's story because it shapes how his legacy was received, interpreted, and distorted by later generations, particularly by the European powers whose engagement with West Africa would take a very different and far more destructive form than anything Musa could have imagined. The European arrival on the West African coast, which began in earnest in the 15th century, proceeded from a specific set of assumptions that were shaped, in part by the very maps that Musa's Hajj had helped to draw. The Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French who established trading posts along the Atlantic coast came seeking gold. They knew it was there. The Catalan Atlas had told them. The reports filtering through Mediterranean trade networks had confirmed it. The image of the African sovereign on his golden throne, Musa's image, had lodged itself in the European imagination as a promise and a provocation. But what the Europeans found when they arrived was not the Mali Empire at its height. It was the Mali Empire in its long twilight, fragmented, diminished, no longer capable of the spectacular demonstrations of wealth and power that had drawn European attention in the first place. The Europeans encountered not the civilization that had produced Musa, but the aftermath of that civilization's decline. And they drew from this encounter conclusions that were as consequential as they were wrong. They concluded that what they saw was all there had ever been. They looked at the political fragmentation, the smaller scale societies, the absence of the monumental stone architecture they associated with civilization, and they concluded that sub-Saharan Africa had never possessed the complex, sophisticated state structures that their own civilization valued. They did not see, or chose not to see, the ruins of what had come before. They did not hear, or chose not to hear, the griot traditions that preserved the memory of Sundiata and Musa and the empire they had built. They did not read because they could not, or would not, the manuscripts of Timbuktu that documented centuries of intellectual achievement. They saw a continent through the narrow lens of their own moment of contact and mistook a snapshot for a history. This misreading became the intellectual foundation for centuries of exploitation. The myth of African primitivity, the idea that sub-Saharan Africa had no history worth speaking of, no civilizations worth respecting, no achievements worth acknowledging, was constructed not from evidence, but from the deliberate or negligent ignoring of evidence. It served a purpose. It made colonialism easier. It made the slave trade easier. It made it easier to treat an entire continent's population as raw material for someone else's prosperity when you had first convinced yourself that they had never built anything of their own. Now, Musa's story is the antidote to this myth. Not because he was exceptional, more, though he was, but because he was the product of a civilization that was itself the product of centuries of political development, economic innovation, and cultural creativity. He did not emerge from a vacuum. He emerged from the Ghana Empire, from Sundiata's founding vision, from the Mandan Charter, from the trans-Saharan trade networks, from the gold fields of Bambouk and Bouré, from the scholarly traditions that had been developing in the Western Sudan for generations before his birth. He was the flowering of a civilization, not an aberration within one. And his story survived, despite everything. Despite the empire's decline, despite the European misreading, despite the colonial destruction of African institutions and the deliberate suppression of African history, the story of Mansa Musa survived. The griots kept it alive. The manuscripts of Timbuktu preserved it. The Arab chroniclers documented it. The maps displayed it. Even the Europeans who chose to ignore the broader context of his civilization could not entirely suppress the sheer, undeniable fact of his wealth and his pilgrimage. He was too vivid, too extraordinary, too well documented to be erased. In the modern era, his story has experienced a remarkable resurgence. Musa has become, for many people around the world, a symbol of African achievement and a corrective to centuries of Eurocentric historical narrative. He appears in documentaries, in school curricula, in social media posts that circulate his image and his story with a frequency and enthusiasm that would have astonished the scholars who first brought his account to wider attention. The claim that he was the richest person who has ever lived has become a staple of popular history, repeated so often and so confidently that it has achieved the status of accepted fact. But this claim deserves examination, because the truth is more complicated and more interesting involved than the headline suggests. The assertion that Musa was the wealthiest person in history is based on modern attempts to estimate the total value of the gold reserves he controlled. These estimates vary wildly, from around $400 billion to figures that are essentially incalculable. The methodology behind such estimates is inherently problematic. How do you assign a modern dollar value to a medieval gold supply whose exact quantity is unknown? How do you compare the wealth of a man who controlled the primary gold source for half the known world with the wealth of, say, a modern tech billionaire whose fortune is denominated in stock valuations that can fluctuate by billions in a single day? How do you account for the difference between personal wealth and sovereign wealth, between gold that Musa personally owned and gold that he controlled as the head of state? These questions do not have clean answers. Comparing wealth across centuries and civilizations is an exercise fraught with methodological pitfalls, and honest scholars acknowledge that any specific number attached to Musa's fortune is more theatrical than scientific. What can be said with confidence is this: relative to the economy he operated within, relative to the total gold supply of the known world in his era, relative to the wealth of every other sovereign whose resources have been documented, Musa's wealth was almost certainly without parallel. He controlled the source of gold at a time when gold was the universal currency of international trade. He sat at the top of an economic system that extracted, processed, and exported gold on a scale that no other single entity matched. And he could spend gold in quantities that crashed the economy of a major foreign power, a feat that no other individual in recorded history has replicated. Whether this makes him the richest person who ever lived in some absolute objective sense is a question that cannot be definitively answered. But it is probably the wrong question. The more interesting question is what he did with his wealth, and what his choices reveal about the relationship between wealth, power, faith, and legacy. Most of the wealthiest individuals in human history have used their fortunes to accumulate more land, more power, more security against the future. Musa did accumulate, but his most famous act was one of dispersal. He gave it away. Not all of it, he was an emperor, not a saint, and he understood that his empire's prosperity depended on maintaining its gold reserves. But the portion he gave away during his Hajj was so large, so conspicuous, and so destabilizing that it became the defining act of his life. The giving was not simple. It was not purely generous, nor purely strategic, nor purely religious. It was all three simultaneously. And the interweaving of these motivations is part of what makes Musa's character so compelling and so resistant to easy categorization. He gave because Islam required him to give. He gave because generosity was expected of a great sovereign in the Monde cultural tradition. The griot praise song celebrated open-handedness as one of the cardinal virtues of kingship, and a Mansa who hoarded his wealth would have been despised, not admired by his own people. And he gave because he understood Seymar with a political intelligence that his contemporaries in Cairo only partly grasped. That spectacle was power, that reputation was strategy, and that the gold he pressed into the hands of Egyptian beggars was purchasing something more valuable than any commodity the Cairo bazaar could offer. the permanent attention and respect of the wider world, and that these three motivations could coexist, that piety, cultural obligation, and political calculation could all drive the same hand that opened over the same pile of gold, is not a contradiction. It is a portrait of a complete human being, a man who was simultaneously devout, culturally grounded, and strategically brilliant, and who saw no conflict between these aspects of himself because they were, in the world he inhabited, genuinely complementary. In the Mali Empire's value system, the good king, the pious Muslim, and the shrewd sovereign were not three different people. They were one person, and that person was Musa. The question of slavery must be addressed directly in any final reckoning with Musa's legacy, because it is the element that most resists the celebratory narrative that has grown up around his name. The 12,000 enslaved servants who carried gold bars through the streets of Cairo were not willing participants in a parade. They were human beings who had been stripped of their freedom, who carried another man's wealth on their backs as a display of his power, and whose individual experiences, their names, their origins, their inner lives, are entirely absent from the historical record. They are visible in the sources only as numbers and as props, instruments of spectacle whose humanity was of no interest to the chroniclers who recorded their presence. This is not a problem unique to Musa. Virtually every pre-modern civilization practiced some form of slavery or coerced labor, and singling out an African sovereign for condemnation while extending implicit absolution to his European, Asian, or Middle Eastern contemporaries would be a double standard of the most transparent kind, but acknowledging that slavery was widespread does not excuse it, and it does not relieve us of the obligation to recognize that Musa's magnificent pilgrimage, the event that cemented his legacy and captured the world's imagination, was built in part on the labor and the suffering of people who had no choice in the matter. The enslaved people in Musa's entourage were drawn from the populations that the Mali Empire had conquered or purchased through the trans-Saharan trade networks. Some were prisoners of war, some were tribute payments from vassal states, some had been born into enslavement. Their conditions varied. Slavery in the Mali Empire, like slavery in most pre-modern societies, existed on a spectrum from the relatively mild to the utterly brutal, and some enslaved people held positions of considerable responsibility and even influence. But the spectrum of slavery is still a spectrum of unfreedom, and the fact that some enslaved people fared better than others does not alter the fundamental injustice of the institution. Musa's legacy must hold both truths simultaneously. He was a man of extraordinary vision, piety, and achievement, who built institutions that enriched his civilization for centuries. And he was a man whose wealth and power rested in part on a system that treated human beings as property. These truths do not cancel each other out. They coexist, uncomfortably, the way they coexist in the legacies of virtually every pre-modern sovereign. And, if we are honest, in the foundations of virtually every modern nation. The discomfort is appropriate. It is the discomfort of encountering history as it actually was rather than as we might wish it had been. There is one more dimension of Musa's legacy that deserves attention, because it operates on a level that transcends the specific details of his reign and speaks to something deeper about how civilizations remember themselves and how the stories they tell about their past shape the possibilities they imagine for their future. For centuries, from the age of exploration through the colonial period and well into the 20th century, the dominant narrative of world history was written by and for Europeans. It was a narrative in which Europe was the protagonist, the engine of progress, the center of civilization, and in which the rest of the world existed primarily as a stage for European action. Lands to be discovered, peoples to be converted, resources to be extracted, histories to be either co-opted or dismissed. Within this narrative, sub-Saharan Africa occupied the lowest position. It was in the infamous formulation of the philosopher Hegel a continent with no history, a place that existed outside the march of progress and that had contributed nothing to the development of human civilization. This narrative was never true. It was always a construction, built from selective evidence and motivated reasoning, designed to justify a particular set of power relationships, but it was powerful, and its effects persist. The structures of global inequality that were established during the colonial period continue to shape the distribution of wealth, power, and opportunity in the modern world. The intellectual habits that dismissed African civilization as non-existent continue to influence, however subtly, how Africa is perceived, discussed, and treated in international affairs, in media representation, and in the quiet assumptions that shape policy decisions worth billions of dollars. Musa's story matters because it disrupts this narrative at its foundations. It presents evidence, documented, corroborated, geographically specific evidence, of an African civilization that was, during the period of its greatest power, wealthier, more organizationally sophisticated, and more globally connected than most of its European contemporaries. It forces a confrontation with the fact that the geography of power and achievement in the 14th century looked nothing like the geography of power that Europeans later constructed and then projected backward onto the past. It demands that the history of human civilization be rewritten to include chapters that were deliberately torn out, and it insists that the rewriting is not a matter of charity or cultural sensitivity, but of basic factual accuracy. This is why Musa appears in classrooms around the world. This is why his image circulates on social media with the frequency of a modern celebrity. This is why the claim that he was the richest person who ever lived has such resonance, not merely because it is a striking superlative, but because it inverts a hierarchy that the modern world has been conditioned to accept as natural. The richest person in history was not a European industrialist or an American tech mogul. He was a West African Muslim emperor who gave away so much gold that he accidentally broke the economy of a foreign power. The sheer improbability of this fact, measured against the expectations that most people carry about who gets to be the wealthiest, the most powerful, the most historically significant, is itself the message. But there is a danger in this resurgence, and it must be noted honestly. The danger is that Musa becomes a token, a single spectacular figure who is invoked to prove Africa's historical significance and then dropped. His civilization left unexplored, his context unexplained, his story reduced to a meme about gold and camels. This would be a different form of the same reductionism that the colonial narrative practiced. Instead of erasing African history entirely, it would reduce it to a single image, the rich king on his golden throne, and leave everything else in shadow. The Ghana Empire, Sundiata, the Mandan Charter, the griots, the manuscripts of Timbuktu, the complex political systems, the sophisticated trade networks, the intellectual traditions, all of this would remain invisible. Hidden behind the gleaming figure of one man on one journey, Musa deserves better than tokenism. His civilization deserves better. And the millions of people who lived in the Mali Empire, who farmed the savannah, who mined the gold, who carried the salt, who studied in the madrasas, who sang the praise songs, who built the mosques and the cities and the trade networks that made everything else possible, deserve better. They deserve to be known not as the supporting cast in one man's spectacular pilgrimage, but as participants in a civilization that endured for centuries and whose achievements rippled outward to shape the world in ways that are still being understood. The sun still rises over the Jingwerber Mosque in Timbuktu. Its earthen walls, maintained across the centuries by the same community-based replastering traditions that have sustained Sahelian architecture for generations, still stand against the sky in the same silhouette that al-Sahili designed nearly 700 years ago. The mosque is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now recognized by the international community as a treasure of global significance. But it was a treasure long before UNESCO existed. It was a treasure when the scholars of Sankor debated jurisprudence in its shadow. It was a treasure when the caravans from the north caught their first glimpse of its minarets rising above the Niger's floodplain. It was a treasure when Musa himself, returning from the Hajj with his architects and his manuscripts and his vision of what his empire could become, looked upon it and saw not just a building but a statement, a declaration in mud and timber and faith, that this land and its people had a place in the story of human civilization that no amount of ignorance or malice could erase. The manuscripts survive, many of them anyway. The political instability that has plagued northern Mali in recent decades, including the armed conflict of 2012, when Islamist militants occupied Timbuktu and deliberately destroyed several historic sites and manuscripts, has placed this irreplaceable heritage in ongoing jeopardy. But the scholarly families of Timbuktu, who have guarded their manuscript collections for generations, have proven as resilient as the griots who preserved the Mandan Charter. Thousands of manuscripts were smuggled out of the city during the 2012 occupation, hidden in footlockers, in car trunks, in donkey carts, carried south to Bamako by families who understood that the words on those pages were worth risking their lives to protect. They understood because their ancestors had understood, because the chain of transmission that Musa had strengthened with his patronage had never been broken, only tested. The chain holds, frayed, threatened, but unbroken. And in the archives and libraries where those manuscripts are now studied, in Bamako, in Dakar, in Cairo, in London, or in Boston, scholars are still reading the words that were written in the cities Musa built, still uncovering the intellectual history of a civilization that the wider world was told had never existed. Every manuscript that is translated, cataloged, and published is another brick removed from the wall of ignorance that was built around Africa's past. Every new study that emerges from this material is a refutation of the myth that sub-Saharan Africa produced nothing worthy of the name scholarship. Every page is evidence, and the evidence accumulated across hundreds of thousands of pages is overwhelming. Musa would have understood this. He was, after all, a man who purchased books in Cairo with the same enthusiasm with which he purchased architectural services. He understood that knowledge, committed to writing and housed in institutions designed to preserve and transmit it, was a form of wealth more durable than gold. Gold could be spent. Gold could be devalued. Gold could be stolen by conquering armies or swallowed by the desert sand. But knowledge, once recorded and disseminated, was almost impossible to destroy entirely. It could be suppressed, hidden, forgotten, but some copy somewhere would survive. Some griot would remember. Some family would guard its manuscripts through occupation and war and the slow erosion of centuries. And eventually someone would read them again. The afternoon light falls golden across the Niger River, catching the slow current and turning it to copper. A pirogue drifts downstream, its boatmen poling through the shallows with the unhurried rhythm of a practice passed down through more generations than anyone can count. On the northern bank, the city of Timbuktu shimmers in the heat, its earthen buildings the same color as the desert that presses against its edges, as if the city and the landscape were made of the same material and could at any moment merge back into one another. Somewhere in that city, in a room whose walls are lined with wooden shelves, a manuscript lies open. Its pages are brown with age, its Arabic script faded but legible. It was written by a scholar who studied at Sankore, who traced his intellectual lineage back through a chain of teachers to the men that Musa brought from Cairo and the Hejaz. The manuscript discusses a point of Islamic jurisprudence, the proper division of inheritance under Maliki law, and it does so with a rigor and a sophistication that would be recognizable to any legal scholar in any tradition. It is a work of the mind produced by a civilization that valued the life of the mind, in a city that was built to house and nurture the life of the mind by a sovereign who understood that the life of the mind was the most enduring thing a ruler could invest in. The manuscript does not mention Musa by name. It does not need to. His fingerprints are on every page, not literally, but causally, structurally, in the chain of patronage and institution building that made the manuscript's existence possible. He is present the way a river's source is present in every drop of water that flows downstream, invisible, essential, the origin of everything that followed. 7 centuries separate the modern world from the afternoon when Mansa Musa rode into Cairo on a golden saddle and broke an economy with his open hand. 7 centuries of transformation, of upheaval, of the slow grinding of civilizations against one another that has produced the world we inhabit now. And yet the questions that Musa's story raises about wealth, about power, about what a civilization owes to those who built it and what it owes to those who remember it are not historical questions. They are present tense questions, alive and urgent, pressing against the glass of the modern moment with an insistence that no amount of temporal distance can diminish. Consider the nature of wealth itself, because Musa's story forces us to confront it in its rawest and most revealing form. In the modern world, wealth is abstract. It exists as numbers on screens, as algorithmic valuations of companies that produce no physical product, as credit instruments so complex that the people who trade them cannot always explain how they work. A man can be worth $100 billion on a Tuesday and $90 billion on a Wednesday, not because anything in the physical world has changed, but because a market's collective mood has shifted. Wealth, in its contemporary form, is largely psychological. A shared agreement about value that persists only as long as the agreement holds. Break the agreement, and the wealth evaporates. It was never really there. It was a story we told each other. And stories can be revised. Musa's wealth was not like this. His wealth was physical. It was gold, a metal you could hold, weigh, the bite to test its purity, carry on the back of a camel or the shoulders of a human being. It did not fluctuate with market sentiment. It did not depend on the continued operation of any institution or the continued confidence of any population. It was real in the most elementary sense of the word. It had mass, it occupied space, it reflected light. When Musa gave a merchant in the Cairo bazaar a handful of gold dust, the merchant did not need to check an exchange rate or consult a financial advisor. He needed only to close his fingers around the dust and feel its weight. The weight was the value. The value was the weight. The transaction was complete the moment skin touched metal. This physicality is what made Musa's generosity so devastating. When a modern central bank engages in quantitative easing, injecting money into an economy by purchasing financial assets, the money it creates is digital, notional, a ledger entry that exists nowhere except in the agreed-upon records of financial institutions. Its effects are real but diffuse, spread across an economy too vast and too complex for any individual participant to perceive directly. When Musa injected gold into the Egyptian economy, the injection was visible, tangible, immediate. You could watch it happen. You could see the gold changing hands in the street. You could see the pile in the merchant stall growing larger hour by hour. You could feel, almost physically, the value draining out of the gold you already possessed as the supply of gold in the market expanded beyond anything the market had been designed to absorb. The Cairo episode was, in modern terms, an inflationary shock. A sudden expansion of the money supply that devalued the existing currency and disrupted the normal functioning of economic exchange. The mechanism was identical to what happens when a government prints too much money. Each unit of currency buys less because there are more units competing for the same quantity of goods. The difference was that Musa's inflation was caused not by a policy decision or a systemic failure, but by one man's hand opening and closing, pressing gold into palm after palm, mosque after mosque, street after street, for weeks on end. Economists have studied this episode, and their analyses confirm what al-Umari's informants observed in real time. The gold price depression in Egypt following Musa's visit was genuine, measurable, and prolonged. It affected not just Egypt, but the broader Mediterranean economy, since Egyptian gold markets were integrated into trade networks that stretched from Venice to Persia. The ripple effects were felt by merchants who had never heard of Mansa Musa, and who could not have located the Mali Empire on a map. They knew only that gold was cheaper than it had been, that the exchange rates they had built their businesses around had shifted, and that the cause of the shift was some foreign king who had passed through Cairo months ago with more gold than anyone had thought possible. The modern parallel that comes closest is not any single economic event, but a category of events. the commodity shocks that periodically disrupt global markets when a sudden change in supply overwhelms existing mechanisms of price stability. The oil shocks of the 1970s. The silver manipulation of the Hunt brothers in 1980. The flooding of global markets with cheap manufactured goods from newly industrialized economies. In each case, the pattern is the same. A system that had achieved a working equilibrium is destabilized by an influx that the system cannot absorb. And the resulting disruption cascades outward along trade networks, affecting participants who are connected to the original shock only through the invisible threads of economic interdependence. Musa's Cairo episode was the medieval version of this pattern, with one crucial difference. The modern commodity shocks are produced by impersonal forces. Geological discoveries, technological changes, political decisions made by committees in distant capitals. Musa's shock was produced by a single identifiable individual acting in accordance with his personal values. He was not a market force. He was a man. He had a name, a face, a horse with a golden saddle. He was standing right there in the bazaar, handing gold to anyone who approached. The impersonal was made personal. The macroeconomic was made human. And this is what makes the episode so enduringly fascinating. Not the economics, which are straightforward, but the image, which is indelible. One man. Too much gold. An economy in ruins. The sheer visual improbability of it, the almost comic disproportion between cause and effect, is what has kept the story alive for 700 years. But the story of Musa's wealth is also the story of its source. And the source leads back to the earth itself, to the riverbeds and shallow deposits of Bambouk and Bura, where men and women labored in conditions that the sources describe only glancingly, if at all. The gold that Musa distributed in Cairo did not materialize from nothing. It was dug from the ground by human hands, washed from gravel by human effort, collected and transported and concentrated through a system of extraction and taxation that began with a miner standing in a riverbed and ended with an emperor seated on a golden saddle. The miners themselves are almost entirely invisible in the historical record. Al-Umari mentions them only in the context of the Mansa's monopoly on gold nuggets above a certain size. Ibn Khaldun refers to the goldfields as an economic fact but does not describe the people who worked them. Ibn Battuta, who came closest to the sources of Mali's gold during his visit, was not permitted to visit the mining regions. The Mali Empire, like many states that controlled valuable natural resources, kept the exact locations and methods of its gold production as closely guarded secrets. Foreign visitors were directed to the trading cities, not the mines. The gold arrived in the markets as if by magic, its origins shrouded in deliberate mystery. This secrecy was strategic. The Mali Empire understood with a sophistication that any modern resource-controlling state would recognize that transparency about the location and scale of gold deposits would invite competition, intervention, and ultimately loss of control. By keeping the goldfields veiled, the empire maintained its monopoly position and its ability to regulate the supply that entered the market. The miners, whether they were free workers, enslaved laborers, or some combination of both, existed behind this veil. Their lives and labor essential to everything the empire accomplished and yet almost completely unrecorded. This erasure is not unique to Mali. The people who extract the raw materials upon which civilizations are built are, with remarkable consistency, the least visible people in those civilizations' historical records. The silver miners of Potosi, the cotton pickers of the American South, the rubber tappers of the Congo, the coltan miners of the modern Democratic Republic of the Congo. In every case, the wealth they produced is celebrated, while the conditions of its production are either ignored or mentioned only as an afterthought. The pattern is so consistent that it appears to be a feature of human record-keeping itself. We document the palace but not the quarry, the feast but not the field, the pilgrimage but not the mine. Musa's story, for all its magnificence, participates in this pattern. The gold that dazzled Cairo was produced by people whose names we will never know, under conditions we can only partially reconstruct. in places that the empire deliberately concealed from outside observation. To tell Musa's story honestly requires acknowledging this absence, not to diminish his achievements but to complete the picture, to restore to the narrative the human foundation upon which the entire structure rested. The emperor and the miner were connected by the same chain of gold. The difference is that the emperor's end of the chain was illuminated by the chronicler's attention, while the miner's end disappeared into the darkness of an unrecorded life. The trans-Saharan trade that carried this gold northward was itself a human achievement of extraordinary magnitude, and it deserves a moment of sustained attention because it represents one of the most underappreciated logistical accomplishments in pre-modern history. The Sahara Desert is not a barrier in the way that an ocean is a barrier. Absolute, impassable without specialized technology. It is a barrier in a more insidious way. It is crossable but barely, and at a cost in human and animal life that makes every successful crossing a minor miracle of planning and endurance. And the distance from the empire's northern trading cities to the Mediterranean coast was approximately 1,000 to 1,500 miles, depending on the route. The journey took between 50 and 90 days. Water sources were spaced at intervals that sometimes exceeded a week's travel, and missing a well, through navigational error, sandstorm, or the simple failure of a known water source to yield water in a particularly dry year, could mean death for an entire caravan. The camels that made these crossings possible were themselves a technology, the biological equivalent of the ships that would later carry European goods across the Atlantic. The dromedary camel, introduced to North Africa from Arabia in the early centuries of the Common Era, was the only animal capable of surviving the Saharan crossing. Its ability to go days without water, to carry heavy loads across soft sand, to endure the extreme temperature fluctuations of the desert environment, made the trans-Saharan trade feasible. Without the camel, the gold of West Africa would have remained in West Africa, and the history of the medieval world would have been fundamentally different. Caravans were organized with military precision. A large caravan might include thousands of camels, hundreds of merchants, and specialized personnel. Guides who knew the routes and the water sources, scouts who ranged ahead to check conditions, guards who protected against Tuareg raiders, drovers who managed the animals, and servants who handled the physical labor of loading, unloading, and maintaining the camp. The investment required to outfit a caravan was enormous, and the risks were commensurate, but the profits, if everything went well, were transformative. A merchant who successfully completed a round trip across the Sahara, carrying manufactured goods south and gold north, could earn returns that dwarfed anything available in the relatively saturated markets of the Mediterranean. The trade was seasonal, timed to avoid the absolute worst of the Saharan heat, and it followed established routes that had been refined over centuries. The western route ran from Morocco through the salt mines of Tagaza to Walata and Timbuktu. The central route connected the oases of the Fezzan in modern Libya to the Lake Chad region. The eastern route linked Egypt to the kingdoms of the central Sudan. Each route had its own characteristics, its own hazards, its own commercial specialties. The western route, which served the Mali Empire most directly, was the route that carried the gold that ended up in Musa's saddlebags, and the route that carried Musa himself to Cairo and back. The human cost of this trade was significant and ongoing. People died on every crossing, from heat, from thirst, from the diseases that flourished in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of oasis stops, from the violence of raiders who preyed on caravans carrying valuable cargo. The bones of men and camels marked the routes like cairns, grim navigational aids that told subsequent caravans they were on the right path. The sources occasionally mention these losses. A caravan that set out with 1,000 camels and arrived with 800. An expedition that lost a third of its men to a sandstorm. But they mention them in the tone of actuarial reports. See, as costs of doing business rather than as human tragedies. And among the goods that crossed the Sahara in both directions, moving alongside the gold and the salt, were enslaved human beings. people treated as commodities, transported across the same killing ground that claimed the lives of free merchants and their animals, and delivered to markets in North Africa and the Middle East, where they were sold to buyers who regarded their purchase as no more morally complex than the purchase of a bolt of cloth or a bar of salt. The trans-Saharan slave trade predated the Mali Empire and outlasted it, and its scale, while difficult to quantify with precision, was substantial enough to constitute a significant component of the trade network's total economic value. This is the context in which Musa's wealth must be understood. It was not clean wealth. It was not wealth that arrived without cost or extracted without suffering. It was wealth produced by a system that included, alongside its genuine achievements in trade, governance, and cultural production, the systematic exploitation of human beings, as miners, as porters, as trade goods, as the visible ornaments of imperial power. The 12,000 enslaved servants carrying gold bars through Cairo were the most spectacular manifestation of this exploitation. But they were not its totality. The exploitation extended backward through the supply chain, from the trading cities where enslaved people were bought and sold, through the caravan routes where they were transported, to the regions where they were captured or purchased in the first place. To hold this reality alongside the genuine magnificence of Musa's achievement, to acknowledge both without allowing either to erase the other, is the fundamental challenge of engaging honestly with pre-modern history. The temptation is always towards simplification. Either celebrate the achievement and ignore the cost, or condemn the cost and dismiss the achievement. Neither approach serves the truth. The truth is that the Mali Empire, like every major civilization in human history, was a complex moral landscape in which genuine brilliance coexisted with genuine cruelty, in which the same systems that produced extraordinary art, scholarship, and governance also produced extraordinary suffering, and in which the people who benefited most from the system and the people who were most damaged by it were often separated by nothing more than the accident of birth. Musa himself was a product of this landscape, shaped by its values, empowered by its structures, limited by its blind spots. He was not more cruel than his contemporaries. By the standards of the 14th century, his treatment of enslaved people appears to have been unremarkable, neither notably harsh nor notably humane. He was not less moral than the European, Arab, or Asian rulers who practiced slavery with equal enthusiasm and considerably less self-reflection. He was a man of his time, operating within the moral framework his time provided, and judging him by standards that did not exist in his era serves no useful purpose. Like what serves a useful purpose is recognizing the pattern, the recurrent civilization-spanning pattern of wealth built on exploitation, and tracing its continuity from the medieval past to the modern present. The gold that Musa distributed in Cairo was mined by people who had no choice in the matter. The cotton that built the antebellum American economy was picked by people who had no choice in the matter. The cobalt that powers the smartphones on which modern readers encounter Musa's story is mined, in some cases, by people, including children, who have no meaningful choice in the matter. The moral distance between the medieval and the modern is shorter than we would like to believe. The pattern persists, the faces change, the structure endures. This recognition does not diminish Musa. It places him within a continuum of human behavior that extends in both directions from his moment in history, backward to the earliest civilizations, and forward to our own. He was not an exception to the pattern, he was an exemplar of it, a man who achieved extraordinary things within a system that was, like all human systems, a mixture of the admirable and the abhorrent. To expect him to have transcended this mixture, to have been the one ruler in human history who achieved greatness without participating in any form of exploitation, would be to demand of him something that no civilization has yet managed to demand of itself. What can be said in Musa's favor, and what distinguishes him from many rulers who commanded comparable resources, is the use to which he put his wealth beyond the Hajj's spectacle. The mosques endured. The madrasas endured. The manuscripts endured. The scholarly traditions endured. These were investments in civilization itself, in the accumulated knowledge and institutional architecture that allow a society to transmit its achievements across generations. Many wealthy rulers have built monuments to themselves. Fewer have built monuments to learning. The distinction matters because monuments to power crumble when the power that built them fades, while monuments to knowledge retain their value regardless of the political fortunes of their patrons. A mosque can outlast the dynasty that commissioned it. A manuscript can be read centuries after the empire that produced it has dissolved into memory and dust. Musa understood this. Whether he understood it consciously as an articulated philosophy of patronage or intuitively, as a felt sense of what mattered most and what would last, the evidence of his choices is clear. He invested in permanence. Not the permanence of gold, which is merely physical, and which, as Cairo demonstrated, can lose its value through the simple mathematics of oversupply. The permanence of knowledge, the permanence of faith, the permanence of institutions designed to outlive the individuals who created them. The Sankor Mosque and its associated university outlived Musa by centuries. The manuscripts produced by the scholars he patronized outlived his empire. The architectural tradition that al-Sahili initiated outlived the specific buildings he designed. The techniques he introduced were adopted, adapted, and transmitted to subsequent generations of builders who continued to develop the Sudano-Sahelian style long after al-Sahili's name was forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians. The chain of scholarly transmission that Musa strengthened with his patronage survived the empire's decline. The Songhai conquest, the Moroccan invasion of 1591, the colonial period, and the political instability of the modern era. It survived because it was not dependent on any single political structure. It was embedded in families, in teaching relationships, in the daily practice of reading, copying, and discussing texts that constituted the living substance of an intellectual tradition. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Musa's story, and it is a lesson that resonates far beyond the specific context of medieval West Africa. The most enduring form of wealth is not material. It is not gold or land or military power or any of the physical instruments through which human beings have traditionally measured their prosperity and security. The most enduring form of wealth is knowledge, organized, transmitted, institutionalized knowledge that allows each generation to begin where the previous generation left off rather than starting from scratch. Civilizations that invest in this form of wealth, that build schools and libraries and universities, that support scholars and artists and thinkers, that create the conditions under which human beings can pursue understanding for its own sake, are the civilizations that leave the deepest marks on human history. They are the civilizations whose contributions outlast their political structures, whose influence persists long after their armies have been defeated and their borders have been redrawn. Musa invested in this kind of wealth. He did so with the same lavish generosity that characterized his distribution of gold in Cairo, but with a more lasting effect. The gold he gave away in Egypt was absorbed by the market and eventually forgotten. Its material substance dispersed, melted, reminted, traded, lost. The knowledge he seeded in Timbuktu and Djenné and Niani and across the breadth of his empire was not absorbed. It accumulated. It grew. It branched outward into new areas of inquiry and backward into deeper engagement with the foundational texts of the Islamic intellectual tradition. It produced scholars who produced students who produced scholars who produced the manuscripts that survive today in the libraries and private collections of West Africa, each one a linker in a chain that stretches back through 7 centuries of unbroken transmission to the moment when a wealthy emperor returned from Mecca with books in his saddlebags and a vision of what his empire could become. The afternoon shadows lengthen across the Niger. The river flows as it has always flowed, its great arc bending northeast through the savannah before curving south toward the sea, carrying the silt and the memory of everything that has ever been built upon its banks. The cities that Musa knew, Niani, Timbuktu, Djenné, Gao, still exist, though none of them occupies the position of power and wealth that it held in the 14th century. The empire is gone. The dynasty is diminished. The gold still lies in the earth, though much of it has been extracted by methods and for purposes that Musa could not have imagined. But the river flows, and somewhere along its banks, in a room made of the same sun-baked earth that has sheltered human life in this landscape for millennia, someone is reading. The text before them is old. How old they may not know precisely. The Arabic script is elegant, the ink faded to brown, the paper foxed and fragile. The words address a question of law or astronomy or theology or medicine, a question that a scholar asked centuries ago and attempted to answer with the tools and the knowledge available at the time. The reader follows the argument, notes where it succeeds, notes where subsequent knowledge has moved beyond it, and understands that they are participating in a conversation that has been ongoing for longer than most nations have existed. This conversation is Musa's truest legacy. Not the gold, not the camels, not the crashed economy of Egypt or the astonished faces of the Mamluk court. These are the dramatic elements of his story, the vivid images that make it memorable and shareable and endlessly retold, but they are the surface. Beneath them, quieter and more consequential, lies the infrastructure of thought and learning that Musa helped to build. An infrastructure that has outlasted everything else about his reign, and that continues even now, to produce returns on an investment made 700 years ago by a man who understood that the most valuable thing a ruler could give his people was not gold, but the means to understand the world they lived in. The evening call to prayer rises from the Jingwereber Mosque. The sound travels across the rooftops of Timbuktu, across the flat expanse of the floodplain, across the river, and out into the gathering darkness of the savannah. It is the same call that has sounded from this mosque since al-Sahili laid its foundations at the command of a king who had traveled 4,000 miles to fulfill the obligation that the call represents. The muezzin who voices it today has never met Musa. He knows the name, as everyone in Timbuktu knows the name. He may know the stories, the gold, the camels, the pilgrimage, the crashed economy. Or he may know only that this mosque was built by a great Mansa long ago, and that it has stood ever since, and that his task is to stand at its minaret and call the faithful to prayer as his predecessor called them, and his predecessor before that, in an unbroken chain of voices stretching back to a time when this city was the intellectual capital of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the bend of the Niger. The call fades. The stars emerge, the same stars that guided the caravans across the Sahara, that the astronomers of Sankor charted and calculated and recorded in manuscripts that some of their descendants are still working to preserve. The night settles over the city, over the river, over the landscape that produced one of the most extraordinary figures in human history and that continues. Despite everything, despite decline, despite colonialism, despite conflict, despite the relentless pressure of a modern world that has not always treated it kindly, to insist on its own significance, its own complexity, its own place in the story of what human beings are capable of building when they are given the resources and the freedom to build. The gold is still in the earth. The knowledge is still in the manuscripts. The stories are still in the mouths of the griots. And the name, Mansa Musa, the Lion of Mali, the Lord of Gold, the man who crashed an economy with his generosity and seeded an intellectual tradition with his patronage. The name endures, spoken now in languages that Musa never heard, in countries that did not exist in his time, by people who are connected to him only by the thin, the unbreakable thread of shared human curiosity about the past and what it can teach us about the present. There is a particular quality to the way history remembers its most vivid figures, a process of distillation that strips away complexity and leaves behind a single concentrated image, potent as a symbol, but dangerously incomplete as a portrait. Alexander becomes the conqueror. Caesar becomes the dictator. Cleopatra becomes the seductress. The human being in all their contradictions and complications, is reduced to a function, a role, a story beaten so thin that light passes through it without encountering resistance. Musa has undergone this distillation. In the popular imagination, he is the rich king, the man with the gold, the walking treasury who crashed Egypt's economy and put Africa on the map. These facts are true, but they are true the way a skeleton is true, and is structurally accurate, but missing everything that made the living body recognizable: the flesh, the breath, the particular way a man held himself when he spoke to a subordinate, or knelt in a mosque, or watched the desert horizon for the first sign of an oasis that might or might not be where his scouts had promised it would be. These things are lost. They were lost the moment the last person who had seen Musa in the flesh closed their eyes for the final time, and no amount of scholarly reconstruction can bring them back. What the sources preserve is the outline, the shape of a life as visible from the outside, rendered in the formal language of court chroniclers and the stylized imagery of griot tradition. Within this outline, certain features are clear. Musa was pious. Musa was generous. Musa was politically astute. Musa was ambitious, not merely for himself, but for his civilization, which he sought to elevate through investment in architecture, scholarship, and diplomatic engagement with the wider world. Musa was proud, in the specific sense that he refused to subordinate himself to any temporal authority and insisted on being treated as the equal of any ruler on earth. And Musa was, in a way that the sources suggest but never explicitly articulate, lonely. A man who bore the weight of an empire on his shoulders and who understood perhaps more clearly than anyone around him that the magnificent edifice he was constructing would not outlast the dynasty's ability to produce rulers capable of maintaining it. This last quality is speculative. The sources do not describe Musa's inner life, and any attempt to reconstruct it is an act of imagination rather than scholarship. But the trajectory of his choices, the relentless building, the insistent patronage, the almost desperate effort to create institutions that would function independently of any single ruler's capabilities, suggests a man who was thinking about legacy, about what would remain when he was gone, about the difference between a kingdom that depended on its king and a civilization that could sustain itself. The fact that his fears proved justified were that the empire did decline after his death, that his successors did prove unequal to the task, does not diminish the effort. It illuminates it. He was building against time, and he knew it, and he built anyway. This is the tension that lives at the heart of every great builder's story. The knowledge that the thing being built will eventually fall, combined with the refusal to let that knowledge stop the building. The pyramids of Giza were built by pharaohs who understood that their dynasties would not last forever. The cathedrals of medieval Europe were built by men who knew they would not live to see the spires completed. The Djinguereber Mosque was built by a man who had watched empires rise and fall across the span of West African history. Who knew? Because the griots had told him? Because the example of Ghana was still fresh in cultural memory that no political structure was permanent? And who built it anyway because the alternative was to leave nothing, and leaving nothing was the one outcome his character could not accept? There is a word in the Mandinka language, fadenya, that scholars of Mande culture have identified as a central organizing concept in the society that produced Musa. Fadenya, roughly translated, means father-childness. The competitive, ambitious, outward-directed energy that drives individuals to surpass their fathers, to exceed what has been done before, to push beyond the boundaries of the known and the accepted. Its complement is badanya, mother-childness, the cooperative, nurturing, inward-directed energy that holds communities together and maintains the social bonds that allow collective life to function. Every Mande individual, every Mande leader, is understood to embody both forces in varying proportions, and the greatest leaders are those who balance them, who channel their fadenya into achievements that benefit the community their badenya sustains. Musa's Hajj was the supreme expression of fadenya, a gesture so extravagant, so far beyond anything his predecessors had attempted, that it redefined the possibilities of what a Mande sovereign could achieve on the world stage. No previous Mansa had undertaken a pilgrimage of this scale. No previous Mansa had distributed gold with this abandon. No previous Mansa had recruited foreign architects and scholars to transform the empire's cities. Musa was not merely fulfilling an obligation, he was exceeding it, spectacularly, in a way that announced to the world and to his own people that the Mali Empire under his rule had entered a new era of ambition and capability. But the Hajj was also an expression of badenya, of the communal, faith-centered, institution-building impulse that sought to strengthen the bonds holding the empire together. The mosques were not for Musa alone. They were for the communities that worshipped in them. The madrasas were not for Musa's personal edification. They were for the generations of students who would study in them long after the Mansa who founded them was dust. The manuscripts were not trophies. They were tools, instruments of learning that would equip the empire's scholars to participate in the intellectual life of the wider world, and through that participation, to strengthen the cultural and religious foundations upon which the empire's social cohesion depended. The balance between these two forces, the competitive and the communal, in the spectacular and the sustainable, the gesture that announces and the institution that endures, Gefort, is the central dynamic of Musa's legacy. The popular imagination has seized on the fadenya, the gold, the camels, the crashed economy, the image of a single man whose wealth exceeded the capacity of a foreign power to absorb it. This is the story that circulates on social media, that appears in listicles and documentaries, that earns Musa his place in the popular consciousness as the richest person who ever lived. It is a compelling story, and it is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The badenya, the quieter, less dramatic legacy of institutions and knowledge, is the part of the story that requires more effort to see and more patience to appreciate, but it is the part that ultimately matters more. The gold that Musa gave away in Cairo was consumed by the market and forgotten within a generation. The mosques he built are still standing. The scholarly traditions he nurtured are still producing knowledge. The manuscripts his patronage made possible are still being read. The competitive gesture was spectacular but transient. The communal investment was modest in comparison but enduring. And the endurance is the point because civilizations are not built by spectacular gestures alone. They are built by the patient, cumulative, often invisible work of creating systems that outlast the individuals who created them. This distinction between the spectacular and the enduring, between the gesture that captures attention and the institution that sustains a civilization, has a particular resonance in the modern world, where the currency of attention has become, in some ways, as powerful as the currency of gold. The modern economy of fame rewards the spectacular. It rewards the viral moment, the outrageous gesture, the act that generates maximum attention in minimum time. It does not reward the slow, patient, often tedious work of building institutions, training scholars, preserving manuscripts, or maintaining the physical and intellectual infrastructure upon which complex societies depend. A man who crashes an economy with his generosity will trend on social media. A man who funds a library will not. Musa did both. And the fact that the first achievement is remembered while the second is largely forgotten tells us something important. Not about Musa, but about ourselves, about the stories we choose to tell, and the values those choices reveal. The manuscripts of Timbuktu have become, in recent decades, a focal point for this broader reckoning with what has been lost, what has been preserved, and what might yet be recovered from the shadows of a history that was written by others. The preservation efforts that accelerated after the 2012 crisis in northern Mali, when Islamist militants associated with Ansar Dine and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb seized Timbuktu and began systematically destroying cultural heritage sites, brought international attention to a treasure that specialists had been working to catalog and conserve for decades. The destruction was targeted and deliberate. The militants set fire to the Ahmed Baba Institute of Higher Learning and Islamic Research, one of the primary repositories for Timbuktu's manuscript collections. They demolished the mausoleums of Sufi saints that had stood for centuries. They smashed the ornate doors of the Sidi Yahya Mosque, which local tradition held had remained sealed since the 15th century and which were considered a sacred trust by the community. The destruction was framed in religious terms, The militants claimed to be purifying Islam of what they considered idolatrous practices, but its effect was cultural annihilation, the deliberate erasure of evidence that contradicted the militants' narrow, ahistorical version of their own faith. But the manuscripts survived, most of them. The families who had guarded these collections for generations and families whose ancestors had been copying, binding, and preserving manuscripts since the centuries immediately following Musa's reign had anticipated the danger. In the months before and during the occupation, a covert operation that has since become one of the great stories of cultural preservation in the 21st century smuggled approximately 300,000 manuscripts out of Timbuktu. They were hidden in trunks, in rice sacks, in the false bottoms of donkey carts. They were transported south along roads controlled by militants, past checkpoints where discovery would have meant the manuscript's destruction and possibly the smuggler's death. They were carried by men and women who understood, with a clarity born of centuries of tradition, that the words on those pages were worth more than their weight in gold, a calculation that Musa himself would have endorsed. The manuscripts reached Bamako, the capital of Mali, where they were housed in secure facilities and where the painstaking work of cataloging, digitizing, and conserving them continues today. The project is enormous. Hundreds of thousands of individual documents, many of them fragile, many of them in languages and scripts that require specialized expertise to read, many of them containing information that has never been incorporated into the broader scholarly understanding of West African history. The work is ongoing, and it will take decades to complete. But it is being done, and every manuscript that is preserved, every text that is translated, every piece of knowledge that is recovered and made accessible to the wider world is a small victory against the forces, minorities ancient and modern, that have sought to erase the evidence of what West African civilization accomplished. The recovery of these manuscripts has begun to reshape the scholarly understanding of the medieval Western Sudan in ways that vindicate the claims that Musa's contemporaries made about his empire's sophistication. Legal texts from the 15th and 16th centuries reveal judicial systems of considerable complexity, with established procedures for evidence, testimony, and appeal that compare favorably to contemporaneous European legal practice. Astronomical treatises demonstrate that Timbuktu scholars were tracking celestial movements and calculating calendars with precision. Medical texts describe treatments for conditions ranging from infectious diseases to mental illness, drawing on both Islamic medical tradition and local pharmacological knowledge. Mathematical manuscripts explore problems of calculation and geometry that were directly relevant to the practical needs of trade, construction, and agricultural management. These were not the productions of a primitive backwater. They were the productions of a civilization that took the life of the mind seriously, that invested resources in the training and support of intellectuals, and that participated fully in the global exchange of knowledge that characterized the medieval Islamic world. The manuscripts are proof, not metaphorical proof, not symbolic proof, but physical, readable, tangible proof that the institutions Musa built worked. They produced the results they were designed to produce. They generated knowledge, preserved it, and transmitted it across centuries. And they did so because someone 700 years ago decided that the wealth flowing out of the goldfields of Bambouk and Bure should be invested not just in spectacle and military power, but in the slow, patient, enormously consequential work of building a civilization of the mind. The modern scholarly engagement with Musa's legacy has also forced a reckoning with the methodological biases that shaped earlier historical accounts. For much of the modern era, The study of West African history was dominated by scholars working within European academic traditions that privileged written sources, archaeological evidence, and the analytical frameworks developed for the study of European and Middle Eastern civilizations. Oral traditions, the primary medium through which West African societies preserved and transmitted their own histories, were treated with suspicion, dismissed as unreliable, or ignored altogether. The griots, who had served as the living constitutional and historical memory of the Mande peoples for centuries, were classified as entertainers rather than historians, their knowledge treated as folklore rather than evidence. This bias has been challenged gradually and unevenly by scholars who have demonstrated that oral traditions, when subjected to the same critical analysis applied to written sources, can yield historical information of considerable reliability and depth. The Epic of Sundiata, for example, has been compared across dozens of independently recorded versions. Collected from different griots in different regions over a period of decades, and the degree of consistency in its core historical claims is remarkable. The major events, the key characters, the political geography, the chronological framework, these remain stable across versions even when the specific language, the dramatic embellishments, and the emphasis shift from one telling to the next. The griots were not simply repeating a fixed text. They were maintaining a flexible but structurally stable body of knowledge, adapting its presentation to different audiences and contexts while preserving its essential content with a fidelity that rivals, and in some cases exceeds, that of written transmission. This recognition has profound implications for how Musa's story is understood. Much of what we know about the Mali Empire comes not from the Arab chroniclers, who, for all their value, were outsiders looking in, while filtered through their own cultural assumptions and limited by the information their informants chose to share, but from the griot traditions that preserved the internal perspective of the civilization itself. The griots remembered what the Arab chroniclers did not know or did not think to ask about: the internal political dynamics of the court, the relationships between clans and lineages, the ritual and ceremonial practices that structured daily life, the moral and philosophical principles that governed the exercise of power. When the griot traditions and the written sources agree, as they do on many key points about Musa's reign, the convergence strengthens our confidence in both. When they diverge, the divergence itself is informative, revealing the different priorities and perspectives of internal and external observers. The griot's version of Musa's story emphasizes different elements than the chronicler's version. Where al-Umari focused on the gold, its quantity, its economic impact, its diplomatic significance, the griot traditions focus on Musa's character, his relationship to the Keita dynasty's founding principles, his embodiment of the virtues that the Mandan Charter had established as the measure of legitimate sovereignty. The griots celebrate his generosity not as an economic event but as a moral quality, evidence that he possessed the open-handedness that the Mande peoples considered essential to righteous kingship. They celebrate his piety not as a diplomatic strategy but as a spiritual achievement, evidence that he had submitted himself to a power greater than his own, which was the precondition for being trusted with power over others. In these two versions of Musa, the external economic Musa of the chroniclers and the internal moral Musa of the griots, are not contradictory. They are complementary. Two angles of vision on the same figure, each revealing aspects that the other misses. The chroniclers saw the spectacle and measured it in gold. The griots saw the character and measured it in virtue. Together they produce a portrait that is richer, more complex, and more human than either could achieve alone. The challenge for modern storytellers is to hold both versions simultaneously, to resist the temptation to reduce Musa to either his wealth or his virtue, to either his spectacle or his substance. He was all of these things, and the tension between them is what makes him interesting. A man who was merely rich would not be worth remembering. A man who was merely virtuous would not have crashed Egypt's economy. The combination, the extraordinary wealth wielded with extraordinary generosity, the political calculation fused with genuine religious conviction, the competitive ambition channeled into communal institution building, is what elevates Musa from a historical figure to a historical presence, a figure whose story continues to generate meaning 7 centuries after his death, because the questions it raises have not been answered. How much is enough? What does a man owe to his faith, and what does he owe to his empire? And what happens when the two obligations conflict? What is the relationship between wealth and wisdom, between material prosperity and spiritual integrity? Can a civilization built on exploitation produce genuine beauty, genuine knowledge, for genuine moral achievement? And if it can, if the manuscripts of Timbuktu are real, if the Jingarabar Mosque is real, if the scholarly tradition is real, what does that mean for how we judge the civilizations that produce them, including our own? These questions do not have answers. They have responses, provisional, partial, shaped by the values and experiences of whoever is doing the responding. Musa's story does not resolve them. It sharpens them. It forces us to confront them in a context that strips away the comfortable assumptions we might bring to more familiar histories, because this is a history that most of us did not learn in school, that does not fit neatly into the narrative frameworks we inherited, and that challenges us to think about power, wealth, and civilization in ways that the dominant historical tradition did not equip us for. The discomfort is productive. It is the discomfort of genuine learning, of encountering a reality that does not conform to expectations, of being forced to revise mental maps that we did not know were incomplete. Every person who encounters Musa's story for the first time and thinks, "How did I not know about this?" is experiencing in miniature the same shock that the Mamluk court experienced in the summer of 1324, and the shock of discovering that the world is larger, more complex, and more surprising than they had imagined, and that the center of wealth and power is not always where they assumed it would be. The cartographic metaphor is apt. Before Musa's Hajj, the maps of West Africa were blank, not because there was nothing there, but because the mapmakers did not know what was there, or did not care to find out, or actively preferred the blankness to the complexity that filling it in would require. After the Hajj, the maps showed a kingdom, a sovereign gold. The blankness was replaced by specificity. The ignorance was replaced by knowledge. The map was redrawn. Every encounter with Musa's story is, in a small way, a redrawing of the map. Every reader, every listener, every student who learns about the Mali Empire and its most famous sovereign is filling in a blank space on their own mental map of the world, a space that should never have been blank in the first place, but that centuries of selective storytelling had left empty. The filling in is not complete. It will never be complete because the sources are limited, the evidence is fragmentary, and the full complexity of a civilization that lasted for centuries cannot be captured in any single narrative, however detailed. But each account that is told, each manuscript that is translated, each scholarly study that adds a new piece to the puzzle, moves us closer to a map that reflects the world as it actually was, rather than the world as one particular civilization chose to describe it. And in this work of cartographic correction, Musa remains the central figure, not because he was the only important person in the history of the Mali Empire, or because his story is the only story worth telling, but because his Hajj was the event that forced the world to notice. He was the one who walked out of the interior, who crossed the desert. Who arrived in Cairo with enough gold to break the market and enough presence to demand a place on the map. He was the one who made the invisible visible. The griots had known all along what the Mali Empire was. The merchants of Niani and Timbuktu had known. The miners in the goldfields had known. The scholars in the madrasas had known. But the wider world had not known, or had not cared, or had not thought to look. Musa made them look. And once they looked, they could not unlook. The image was too vivid, too extraordinary, too charged with implications that the lookers could not fully process but could not ignore. The rich king on his golden throne, surrounded by more gold than Cairo had ever seen, Dispensing wealth with a hand that seemed incapable of closing, this image burned itself into the collective memory of every civilization that encountered it, and it has not faded in 700 years. It has, if anything, grown brighter, as the modern world, with its own anxieties about wealth, inequality, and the distribution of power, has found in Musa's story a mirror for its own preoccupations. The mirror reflects in both directions. When we look at Musa, we see a man grappling with questions that we ourselves have not resolved. When Musa, if we could imagine him looking back at us across the centuries where it looks at our world, he might see a civilization that has mastered the production of wealth beyond anything he could have imagined, but that has not yet found a way to distribute it, that does not leave vast populations in poverty. He might see cities more magnificent than Cairo, but also slums more wretched than anything the medieval world produced. He might see institutions of learning that would have awed the scholars of Sankore, but also a willful ignorance about the history and achievements of entire civilizations that would have baffled a man who traveled 4,000 miles to learn from cultures different from his own. He might see, in short, a world that has more gold than it knows what to do with, and less wisdom than it needs. And he might recognize, with the wry understanding of a man who once crashed an economy through the simple act of opening his hand, that the fundamental problem of human civilization has not changed in 7 centuries. The problem is not the production of wealth. The production of wealth is something human beings are extraordinarily good at. The problem is what to do with it once it has been produced, how to use it in ways that strengthen the bonds of community rather than dissolving them, that build institutions capable of outlasting the individuals who create them, that invest in the slow, patient, unglamorous work of knowledge and understanding rather than the spectacular but transient gestures of display and consumption. Musa did not solve this problem. No one has. But he engaged with it more directly, more visibly, and with greater consequences than almost any other figure in human history. He had more gold than anyone, and he made a choice about what to do with it. The choice was complicated, a mixture of faith, ambition, cultural obligation, and political calculation that cannot be reduced to any single motivation. But the choice was made, and its effects are still being felt. And the fact that we are still talking about it 700 years later suggests that it touched something essential about the human condition, something that transcends the specific circumstances of 14th century West Africa and speaks to the universal question of what wealth is for. The river does not answer the question. Rivers do not answer questions. They flow, carrying with them the silt of everything that has ever happened along their banks, depositing it downstream in layers that future generations will excavate and examine and argue about. The Niger has been carrying the silt of the Mali Empire for 7 centuries. Some of it has settled into the floodplains that still feed the communities along the river's course. Some of it has been carried out to sea, dispersed into the vast Atlantic that Musa's predecessor may or may not have tried to cross. Some of it remains suspended in the current, visible only when the light catches it at the right angle. A faint golden shimmer in brown water, there and then gone, real but ungraspable, like the memory of a man who once possessed more gold than the world could absorb, and who chose, for reasons that were entirely his own and yet speak to something in all of us, to give it away. The question persists. What is wealth for? Because the question outlives every answer that has ever been offered, because every answer is provisional, shaped by the values and circumstances of the person offering it. The pharaohs answered it by building tombs. The Roman emperors answered it by building roads and aqueducts and arenas. The medieval popes answered it by building cathedrals. The modern billionaires answer it by building companies, foundations, space programs, and occasionally by building monuments to their own egos that differ from the pharaohs' tombs only in their materials and their aesthetics. Musa answered it by building mosques and madrasas and libraries, by investing in the infrastructure of faith and knowledge, and by giving gold away in the streets of a foreign city until the economy buckled under the weight of his generosity. His answer was not perfect. It was not complete. It did not prevent the decline of his empire or the suffering of the enslaved people whose labor made his wealth possible. But it was an answer offered at a scale and with a sincerity that commanded the respect of every civilization that witnessed it. And it continues to command respect today, and not because we agree with every aspect of how Musa used his wealth, but because the seriousness with which he engaged the question of what wealth is for puts to shame the trivial uses to which comparable wealth is often put in the modern world. The comparison is not entirely fair. Musa operated within a moral framework, Islamic, Mande, imperial, that provided clear guidance on the obligations of wealth and the virtues of generosity. Modern billionaires operate within a moral framework, capitalist, individualist, secular, that provides almost no guidance on these questions and that actively rewards the accumulation of wealth regardless of how it is used. Musa was expected to give. Modern wealth holders are expected to grow. The structural incentives are different, and comparing the behaviors they produce without acknowledging the difference is intellectually dishonest. But the comparison persists because the human hunger for models of meaningful wealth, for examples of what it looks like when extraordinary resources are deployed in service of something larger than personal aggrandizement, is deep and enduring. And Musa's story satisfies it in ways that modern examples rarely do. He is, for many people who encounter his story, a proof that another way of relating to wealth is possible, that the accumulation of gold does not have to be an end in itself, that generosity can be a source of power rather than a drain on it, that investing in knowledge and faith and community can produce returns that outlast any financial instrument. Whether this reading of Musa is historically accurate in all its details is, in a sense, beside the point. All historical figures who endure in popular memory are partly real and partly constructed, composites of documented fact and projected meaning, shaped as much by the needs of the present as by the realities of the past. The Musa who circulates in modern popular culture is not identical to the Musa who rode into Cairo in 1324. He is larger, simpler, more symbolic, a figure onto whom the modern world projects its own anxieties and aspirations about wealth, race, history, and the distribution of power. This is what happens to historical figures who become legends. The legend consumes the person and replaces them with something that is simultaneously less true and more meaningful. The task of honest storytelling is to resist this consumption without denying its power, to tell the legend and the history simultaneously, acknowledging where they converge and where they diverge, and trusting the audience to hold both without needing to choose between them. Musa was a real person who lived in a real place and made real decisions with real consequences. He was also a symbol whose meaning has evolved over 7 centuries and continues to evolve today. Both of these things are true, but neither cancels the other. The evening deepens over the western Sudan. The last light catches the surface of the Niger, turning it to hammered bronze before the darkness claims it entirely. In the villages along the river, the day's work is ending. The farmers returning from the fields, the fishermen pulling their nets, the children finishing the games that children everywhere play in the hour before dinner. The rhythms of life along this river have changed in 7 centuries. Technology, politics, religion, language, all of these have shifted in ways that would make the landscape unrecognizable to Musa if he could return to see it. And yet the fundamentals persist. The river still floods and recedes with the seasons. The millet still grows in the red laterite soil. The heat still presses down from a sky so vast that it seems to mock the smallness of human endeavor. And the stories are still told. In a compound somewhere along the upper Niger. It does not matter precisely where, because this scene is repeated in variations across the entire length of the river and beyond. An elder is speaking. The children gathered around him have heard this story before, or parts of it, but they listen again because the story changes with each telling, not in its facts, but in its emphasis, in the details the teller chooses to foreground, in the connections he draws between the ancient events and the present moment. The elder's voice is unhurried. He has all evening. The story has all the time in the world because it has been being told for 700 years and shows no sign of stopping. He tells them about a Mansa, a great a Mansa who ruled an empire so vast that a man could walk for months and never leave its borders. A Mansa who commanded so much gold that he could give it away by the camel load and still have more than any other sovereign on earth. A Mansa who traveled across the desert to the holy city, and who on his way stopped in a great foreign capital and gave away so much gold that the city's markets collapsed and did not recover for a generation. The children's eyes widen at the gold. They always do. The gold is the part of the story that captures the imagination first, the detail that lodges in the mind and refuses to let go. 80 camels, 300 pounds each, 12,000 servants. The numbers are enormous, almost incomprehensible, and the elder lets them land with the full weight of their enormity before moving on. But the gold is not where he lingers. He lingers on the mosques. He lingers on the scholars. He lingers on the books, the manuscripts that were brought from far away and that multiplied in the libraries of the empire's cities until the books themselves became more valuable than the gold that had paid for them. He tells the children that the greatest wealth a ruler can possess is not what he holds in his hand, but what he places in the minds of his people. He tells them that gold can be taken, but knowledge, once given, cannot be stolen back. He tells them that this is what the Mansa understood, and this is why his name is still spoken when the names of richer men, men who hoarded their wealth, who built nothing, yea, who left nothing, have been forgotten by everyone, even by the rivers that once flowed past their doors. The children listen. Some of them will remember, some of them will tell the story again years from now to children of their own, adjusting the emphasis, updating the connections, but preserving the core. The gold, the pilgrimage, the mosques, the books, the name. Mansa Musa. The chain of transmission holds. It is held for 7 centuries. It bends under the weight of time and circumstance, but it does not break because the people who carry it understand that what they carry matters. That the story is not merely entertainment but identity. Not merely history but instruction. Not merely the record of what one man did 700 years ago, but a template for what any person, in any era, he might aspire to do with whatever resources the world has placed in their hands. The fire burns low. The elder's voice softens not from fatigue, but from the instinct that every storyteller shares, the understanding that the most important words are best delivered quietly, so that the listener must lean in, must close the distance between speaker and spoken to, must make the act of receiving the story a conscious choice rather than a passive absorption. He tells them one more thing. He tells them that the Mansa's journey was not only outward, across the desert, across the foreign lands, through the streets of Cairo where the gold fell like rain from a clear sky. The journey was also inward. The man who left Niani was not the same man who returned. Something had changed in the space between departure and arrival, between the first step into the Sahara and the last step back through the gates of his capital. The gold he carried out came back diminished. The man who carried it came back enlarged, and the difference between what was lost and what was gained, the gold spent versus the knowledge acquired, the wealth dispersed versus the institutions built, that difference was the measure of the journey's true worth. The children sit with this. Some of them understand it. Some of them will understand it later, when the circumstances of their own lives have given them the framework to recognize what the elder is describing there. The paradox of productive loss, the alchemy by which giving away makes a person larger rather than smaller, the counterintuitive mathematics of generosity in which subtraction is addition and emptying is filling, find that they will encounter this paradox in their own lives, in moments that have nothing to do with gold or empires or the streets of Cairo, and when they do, some of them will remember the Mansa, and the story will complete its circuit, from the past through the present, and into a future that neither the elder nor the children can see, but that both can feel approaching. The way a person standing on a riverbank can feel the current pulling at the water even before the water reaches their feet. This is how civilizations remember, not through monuments alone, though the monuments matter, not through manuscripts alone, though the manuscripts are irreplaceable, not through the pronouncements of historians or the calculations of economists or the labels affixed to museum displays. Civilizations remember through the act of telling, through the voice that rises in the evening and carries across the compound, through the child who listens and stores the story in a place deeper than conscious memory, through the repetition that is not repetition at all but renewal, each telling a fresh negotiation between the fixed past and the fluid present. The griots understood this. They built their entire vocation around it. And the civilization they served understood it too, which is why it invested in their training and their maintenance with the same seriousness that other civilizations invested in their scribes and their archivists and their libraries of stone. The griot tradition is threatened today. The forces of modernization, urbanization, and globalization, the same forces that have disrupted traditional knowledge systems everywhere on Earth, have weakened the structures that sustained the griots for centuries. Fewer young people are training in the art. The ceremonial functions that once guaranteed griots a central role in community life have diminished in frequency and significance. The stories are still told, but they compete now with television, with radio, with the infinite scroll of digital content that offers 1,000 narratives for everyone that the griot can deliver. The chain of transmission that survived the fall of the Mali Empire, the Songhai conquest, the Moroccan invasion, the colonial period, and the political upheavals of independence is facing in the 21st century for a challenge unlike any it has previously encountered. Not the violent suppression of knowledge, but the quiet displacement of it. The slow erosion of attention that occurs when a society's informational environment becomes so saturated that no single voice can command the sustained listening that the griot tradition requires. And yet the tradition persists, in modified forms, in new contexts, through adaptations that would astonish the griots of Musa's court, but that preserve the essential function, the transmission of identity through narrative, the anchoring of a people's sense of themselves in the stories they tell about their past. Modern griots perform at festivals, record albums appear on television and on YouTube. Some have achieved international fame, carrying Mondi music and storytelling to audiences across the world. Or the kora, the 21-stringed harp lute that is the griot's signature instrument, can be heard in concert halls in Paris and New York and Tokyo, its complex cascading melodies reaching ears that have never heard the Niger's current or felt the harmattan's grit. This is adaptation, not surrender. The griots have always adapted. To Islam, to empire, to colonial rule, to independence, to whatever new reality the turning of history imposed upon the societies they served. The content of the stories has shifted over the centuries. The context in which they are performed has transformed beyond recognition. But the impulse that drives the telling, the conviction that a people who forget their past are diminished, that the stories of great men and women must be preserved not as relics but as living instructions, that the act of telling is itself a form of resistance against the entropy that threatens every human achievement with oblivion. This impulse has not changed. It is the same impulse that led a griot in Musa's court to commit the Mansa's deeds to the architecture of memory, knowing that the memory would outlast the court, outlast the empire, outlast every physical structure that Musa's gold had built. The griot was right. The memory has outlasted everything. The court is gone. The empire is gone. The gold has been dispersed across the earth, melted and reminted and traded through so many hands that no atom of the metal Musa carried to Cairo could be identified today. The buildings have crumbled and been rebuilt and crumbled again and been rebuilt again. The Jingaribber Mosque's earthen walls requiring annual replastering that is itself a form of communal memory. The whole community participating in the physical renewal of a structure that represents their collective identity. Everything material has been transformed, but the story remains, changed in its details, adapted to new contexts, told in languages Musa never spoke and through media he never imagined, but recognizable, continuous, alive. There is something in this continuity that defies the logic of material history. By every measurable standard, the Mali Empire should be forgotten. It left no stone ruins comparable to Rome's or Egypt's. It produced no written chronicles in its own languages. Its internal history was oral, and oral history by its nature leaves no physical trace that can be excavated or displayed in a museum. Its geographic remoteness from the centers of global power in subsequent centuries meant that no major imperial successor had a vested interest in preserving its memory the way the Ottoman Empire preserved the memory of Byzantium, or the British Empire preserved, selectively, self-servingly, the memory of Rome. The forces of forgetting were overwhelming, and yet the forgetting did not succeed. The name survived. The story survived. The gold, even in memory, retained its luster. The survival is partly due to the Arab chroniclers, whose written accounts ensured that Musa's story was preserved in a medium that could resist the erosive forces that threaten oral tradition. Al-Umari's careful interviews, Ibn Khaldun's systematic genealogies, or Ibn Battuta's sharp-eyed observations were. These texts were copied, circulated, stored in the libraries of the Islamic world, and eventually discovered by European scholars who brought them to the attention of a global audience. Without the chroniclers, Musa's story might have survived only within the Mande oral tradition, visible to specialists in West African studies but invisible to the wider world. The chroniclers gave the story a second medium of transmission, a backup system that ensured its survival, even if the primary system, the griots, was disrupted. But the survival is also due to the story itself, to the intrinsic qualities that make it resistant to forgetting. Some stories are forgettable because they are ordinary, because they describe events that are common to every civilization and that carry no distinguishing charge. Musa's story is not ordinary. It contains an image, one man, too much gold, a foreign economy in ruins that is so vivid, so improbable, so charged with implications about wealth and power and the relationship between civilizations that it lodges in the mind the way a splinter lodges in skin. Once you have encountered the image, you cannot unencounter it. It becomes part of your mental furniture, a permanent fixture in the room where you store your understanding of what the world has been and what human beings are capable of. This is the quality that separates the stories that endure from the stories that fade. Not accuracy, not completeness, not moral clarity, but vividness. The capacity to generate a single image so powerful that it survives the decay of every context that originally gave it meaning. The Trojan horse. In Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Cortez burning his ships, Washington crossing the Delaware. These images persist not because they are historically precise, most of them are simplified, embellished, or outright invented, but because they crystallize something essential about the human experience in a form that resists paraphrase and defies forgetting. Musa's image belongs in this company. The emperor on his golden horse, his hand open, gold falling through his fingers into the outstretched palms of strangers, the market stalls overflowing with a metal that is losing its value with every handful he dispenses. This is an image that contains in a single frame an entire argument about the nature of wealth, the limits of generosity, the unintended consequences of good intentions, and the shock that occurs when civilizations that have existed in mutual ignorance suddenly collide. It is an image that speaks differently to different eras. To the medieval Islamic world, it spoke of West Africa's unexpected power. To the colonial era, it spoke of the riches that might be extracted. To the modern era, it speaks of the historical erasure that prevented most people from knowing this story existed. And this polyvalence, this capacity to generate new meanings and new contexts, is what ensures its survival. The image also speaks to something that no era has been able to resolve, a tension that is as present in the 21st century as it was in the 14th. The tension between the desire to give and the consequences of giving, and between generosity as a moral imperative and generosity as an economic force that can devastate the very communities it intends to help. Modern development economics is haunted by this tension. The debates about foreign aid, whether it helps or hinders, whether it creates dependency or enables development, whether the intention of the giver matters more than the outcome for the receiver, are at their core the same debate that Musa's Hajj provoked in Cairo 700 years ago. He gave with a pure heart and crashed a market. His generosity was sincere, and its effects were devastating. The moral calculation does not resolve neatly, and the refusal to resolve neatly is what keeps the story active, productive, endlessly available for reinterpretation. The night deepens. The elder has finished speaking. The children drift towards sleep. In carrying the story into that liminal space where consciousness dissolves, and the material the mind has absorbed during waking hours is processed, sorted, and stored, some of the story's details will be lost by morning. Specific numbers, particular names, the sequence of events that the elder presented with such careful attention to chronology. But the core will remain. The gold will remain. The image of the man who had too much and gave too much and changed the world by the simple act of opening his hand, Kinu. This will remain filed away in the deep architecture of memory where the stories that matter most are kept, alongside the first stories the children ever heard and the last stories they will ever tell. In Bamako, in a climate-controlled room that would have been incomprehensible to any resident of the 14th century Mali Empire, and a conservator bends over a manuscript. The page before her is perhaps 500 years old, perhaps older. The paper is handmade, its fibers visible under the magnifying glass she uses to examine the ink. The script is Arabic, but the marginalia, notes added by later readers, corrections, cross-references, include words in Fulfulde and Songhai and Tamashek, evidence that this manuscript passed through the hands of scholars from multiple linguistic communities, each one finding something of value in its contents and adding their own layer of engagement to the palimpsest. The conservator is digitizing the manuscript, creating a high-resolution scan that will preserve its contents in a medium immune to the physical decay that threatens the original. When she finishes, the manuscript's text will be accessible to scholars anywhere in the world, readable on screens in libraries from Dakar to Delhi, searchable, analyzable, available for the kind of comparative study that was impossible when these texts existed only as physical objects in private collections scattered across the cities of the Western Sudan. She does not think about Mansa Musa as she works. She is thinking about the pH level of the paper, about the appropriate humidity for long-term storage, about the grant deadline for the next phase of the digitization project. Her work is technical, painstaking, and unglamorous, the kind of work that never makes headlines and never will. But it is, in a very real sense, the continuation of the project that Musa began when he returned from the Hajj with manuscripts in his saddlebags and a determination to build an intellectual infrastructure worthy of his empire's wealth. The conservator is a link in the chain. She may not know it. She may not frame her work in those terms, but the chain does not require its links to be aware of their position within it. It requires only that they hold. Across the city, in a university classroom, a young historian is presenting her doctoral research on the legal manuscripts of Timbuktu. Her thesis argues that the 15th century legal tradition of the Western Sudan developed sophisticated mechanisms for resolving commercial disputes that anticipated, by several centuries, certain principles of modern international commercial arbitration. Where her audience is skeptical, the claim is ambitious, and the evidence, while suggestive, requires further corroboration. But she is making the argument, and the argument is being heard, and the mere fact that a doctoral dissertation in the 21st century can be built on the intellectual productions of a civilization that the dominant historical narrative claimed had no intellectual productions is itself a kind of victory. Quiet, incremental, the kind of victory that changes nothing overnight and everything over decades. The historian does not think of herself as continuing Musa's project. She thinks of herself as a scholar doing her job, following the evidence where it leads, contributing to the accumulation of knowledge that is the purpose and the justification of the academic enterprise. But the evidence she follows was produced by institutions that Musa funded. The manuscripts she reads were preserved by families whose commitment to scholarship was shaped by the culture of learning that Musa promoted. The university where she presents her findings exists within a global system of higher education, whose most distant roots include the madrasas that Musa established or supported across his empire. The connections are indirect, attenuated by centuries of intervening history, but they are real. The chain holds. And in a recording studio somewhere in the world, it does not matter where, because this is happening in many places simultaneously, a musician is playing the kora. The instrument's 21 strings shimmer under his fingers, producing the cascading or luminous sound that has characterized Mande music for centuries. He is playing a traditional piece, one of the great songs of the griot repertoire, and the melody carries within it the DNA of a musical tradition that stretches back to the courts of the Mali emperors. The notes he plays are not the same notes that a griot in Musa's court would have played. The tradition has evolved, absorbed influences from Arabic music, from the blues that West African musical forms helped to create in the Americas, from the global circulation of sound that characterizes the modern era. But the root is the same. The emotional landscape is the same. The sense of a voice speaking across time, carrying the weight of a history that is too large and too important to be left unspoken. This is the same. The musician finishes the piece. The last notes hang in the studio's treated air for a moment, then decay into silence. He removes his headphones, nods to the engineer behind the glass, and begins to pack up his instrument. Tomorrow, the recording will be mixed, mastered, and uploaded to a streaming platform where it will be available to anyone in the world with an internet connection. A song whose ancestors were performed for Mansa Musa in the palace at Niani will be accessible to a teenager in Sao Paulo, a commuter in Seoul, a student in Stockholm. The griot tradition, adapted to the medium of the age, continues to transmit. The chain holds. It holds because the story it carries is too important to drop. Not important in the way that political events are important, not because it changed the distribution of power in the short term or altered the outcome of a specific conflict. Important in the way that certain stories are important to the species as a whole, because they demonstrate something about what human beings are capable of that might otherwise be forgotten, denied, or never imagined in the first place. The story of Mansa Musa demonstrates that a civilization emerged in the interior of West Africa that was, by the standards of its age, among the most wealthy, most organizationally sophisticated, and most culturally productive on Earth. It demonstrates that this civilization engaged with the wider world on its own terms, meeting the great powers of its era as an equal, and leaving an impression that those powers could not forget. It demonstrates that the wealth this civilization produced was invested not merely in military power or personal luxury, but in the infrastructure of knowledge and faith that allows a society to transcend the lifespan of any individual ruler. And it demonstrates that the story of human achievement is far broader, far more diverse, and far more surprising than the standard narratives have allowed. That the map of the past, like the map of the present, has blank spaces that are not empty but merely unexamined, waiting for the attention that will reveal what has been there all along. This is what the griots have always known. This is what al-Umari sensed when he sat in Cairo 12 years after the fact, interviewing men who still spoke of Musa's visit with the hushed tones of people describing a natural disaster or a divine intervention. And this is what Abraham Cresques understood when he placed Musa's image on the Catalan Atlas, a dark-skinned sovereign on a golden throne, holding a nugget of gold the size of his fist, in a region of the map that his predecessors had left blank. This is what the families of Timbuktu understood when they smuggled their manuscripts past armed checkpoints in the backs of donkey carts, risking their lives to preserve pages of faded Arabic script that most of the world did not know existed. They all understood, each in their own way, that they were custodians of something that mattered, that the knowledge they preserved and the story they carried was not merely interesting or entertaining, but essential, a piece of the human record without which the record was incomplete. and the species' understanding of itself was diminished. The night is fully dark now over the western Sudan. The stars are out, the same stars that the astronomers of Sankor charted, that the caravan guides used to navigate the Sahara, that Musa himself must have watched during those long desert nights when the column of 60,000 people bedded down in the sand, and the fires burned low, and the silence of the desert pressed in from every direction like a physical weight. The stars do not care about empires. They do not register the rise and fall of civilizations, the accumulation and dispersal of gold, the construction and destruction of mosques and libraries and manuscripts. They burn according to their own physics, indifferent to the tiny dramas enacted on the surface of the planet that orbits one of their number. And yet human beings have always looked at them and seen meaning, have projected onto their patterns the stories and the structures that give human life its shape and its significance. Musa looked at these stars. We can be certain of this because everyone who crosses the Sahara looks at the stars. They are, in that landscape, the most prominent feature of the nighttime environment. And their beauty in the clear desert air is, by all accounts, of a quality that compels attention even from the most practically minded traveler. He looked at them, and he saw what? The constellations that Arab astronomers had named, and that the scholars of his empire were learning to chart? The manifestations of divine creation that his faith taught him to revere? The navigational markers that told his guides how far they had come and how far they had yet to go? All of these probably. And perhaps something else, something that the sources do not record and that we can only imagine because it belongs to the interior life of a man who lived 7 centuries ago and whose thoughts, in their specificity, are as lost to us as the individual grains of gold dust that sifted through his fingers in the bazaars of Cairo. Perhaps he thought about time, about the fact that the light he was seeing had traveled for years, and in some cases for centuries, before reaching his eyes, about the fact that the stars he was looking at might already be dead, their light a kind of memory, a message from a past that no longer existed except in the radiance it had left behind. Perhaps he understood, in whatever terms his cosmology provided, that light outlasts its source, that the luminance a thing produces during its existence continues to travel through space long after the thing itself has been extinguished, reaching eyes that the source never knew would exist, illuminating landscapes the source never knew would be seen. If he thought this, he was thinking about his own legacy, whether he knew it or not. Because this is precisely what happened. The source, the Mali Empire, Musa's reign, the specific historical moment that produced the Hajj and everything that followed, has been extinguished. The empire is gone. The man is gone. The gold is dispersed. But the light travels on. It reaches us in the form of manuscripts and maps and griot songs and architectural forms and scholarly traditions and popular narratives and social media posts and bedtime stories told by elders to children in compounds along the Niger. It reaches us diminished by distance, altered by the media through which it has passed, incomplete in ways that frustrate the scholar and challenge the storyteller, but it reaches us. Across 7 centuries and 4,000 miles and the immeasurable distance that separates any historical figure from the people who try to understand them, the light of Musa's life continues to arrive. And when it arrives, it illuminates not just the past, but the present. Not just what was, but what is. Not just who Musa was, but who we are. The heirs of a world he helped to shape, and the custodians of a story we did not create but are responsible for transmitting. The illumination is not comfortable. It reveals things we might prefer not to see. The depth of historical ignorance about African civilizations, the persistence of prejudices that should have been abandoned centuries ago, the uncomfortable continuities between the exploitation that underwrote Musa's wealth and the exploitation that underwrites our own. But comfort is not the purpose of illumination. Understanding is. And understanding, even when it is difficult, even when it requires the revision of cherished assumptions, is always preferable to the darkness of ignorance. The wind shifts. A faint breath of air moves across the floodplain. in carrying with it the smell of water and laterite and the almost imperceptible sweetness of flowering acacia. The Niger continues its unhurried passage through the landscape, its surface now invisible in the darkness, but its presence felt in the sound of the current, in the humidity of the air, in the knowledge that it is there as it has been there for millennia, carrying its burden of silt and memory toward the sea. On its banks, in the cities and villages, and scattered compounds that line its course, life continues in patterns that are simultaneously ancient and modern. The daily negotiations between tradition and innovation, between the inherited past and the improvised present, that characterize every human community on Earth. The people who live along the Niger today are not living in Musa's empire. They are living in nations, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Guinea, whose borders were drawn by colonial powers and whose political and economic structures bear the imprint of a history that Musa could not have anticipated. But they are living on the same land, drinking the same water, farming the same soil, and carrying, in their cultural memory and in the institutions that have survived from the medieval period, the traces of a civilization that was for a time among the greatest on Earth. The traces are everywhere, for those who know how to look. In the architecture of the mud mosques that still dot the savanna landscape, their forms descended from the tradition that al-Sahili brought from Andalusia and fused with local building practices. In the music of the kora and the balafon, horn, whose melodic structures encode centuries of aesthetic refinement. In the social organization of the Manda peoples, whose clan relationships and hereditary occupational categories still reflect the framework established by the Mandan Charter. In the griot families who still bear the names, Koyate, Diabate, Kante, that appear in the Epic of Sundiata and that have been associated with the art of oral history for 800 years. In the annual replastering of the Great Mosque of Jenne, when the entire community gathers to coat the building's massive walls with fresh banco, a ritual of collective maintenance that is also a ritual of collective memory, a physical enactment of the principle that the things worth building are the things worth maintaining, and that maintenance is not a chore but an act of devotion. These traces are not fossils. They are not the dead remains of a vanished world, preserved in amber for the inspection of scholars. They are living elements of a living culture, adapted to contemporary conditions but continuous with a past that stretches back through Musa's reign and beyond, to Sundiata's founding vision, and to the even deeper roots of Mande civilization that the Epic of Sundiata itself acknowledges but does not fully illuminate. The past is not past. It is present, in the forms of the buildings, in the structures of the music, in the relationships between the families, in the stories that are told, and the values those stories transmit. It is present the way a river's source is present in every drop of water that flows past a village 1,000 miles downstream, invisible, distant, but causally essential, and the origin without which the present flow would not exist. Musa is part of this presence, not the dominant part. The dominant part is the accumulated contribution of millions of people across centuries, the unnamed farmers and traders and builders and scholars and musicians and mothers and fathers whose individual lives were not recorded by any chronicler, but whose collective effort created the civilization that produced Musa, and that he, for a brief, spectacular moment, represented to the world. To focus too exclusively on Musa, to treat him as the sole protagonist of the Mali Empire story, would be to replicate the very error that the griot tradition was designed to prevent. The griots celebrate great individuals, but they celebrate them as expressions of a collective achievement, as peaks in a mountain range rather than isolated summits. Musa was the highest peak, but the range made him possible, and the range is what endures. The final word belongs not to the emperor but to the civilization, to the unnamed multitudes who mined the gold and carried the salt, and crossed the desert and built the mosques and copied the manuscripts and sang the songs and told the stories and lived the lives that, in their aggregate, constituted one of the great achievements of the human species. They deserve to be remembered, not as the supporting cast in one man's spectacular pilgrimage, but as the protagonists of their own stories, stories that were just as real, just as consequential, and just as worthy of preservation as the one that happened to be recorded by the chroniclers who happened to be in Cairo in the summer of 1324. Their names are lost. Their individual experiences are unrecoverable. The particular quality of light on a particular morning in a particular village along the upper Niger in the year 1330, the way it fell across a particular woman's face as she ground millet for her family's breakfast, the sound of her children's voices in the compound behind her, the smell of smoke from the cooking fire and the distant, almost subliminal rumble of the river. These things are as gone as if they had never been. History preserves the exceptional and discards the ordinary, and the ordinary lives of ordinary people in the Mali Empire have been discarded as thoroughly as the ordinary lives of ordinary people in every other civilization that has ever existed. But they were there. They were real. They had full human experiences: love, grief, hope, boredom, wonder, fear, the particular satisfaction of work well done and food shared with people you care about, that were no less rich, no less complex, no less deserving of attention than the experiences of the Mansa on his golden horse, and the civilization they built, collectively, through the daily accumulation of effort and creativity and adaptation, was the foundation upon which everything else rested. The gold trade, the political system, the military power, the cultural achievements, the Hajj itself. Without them, there is no Mali Empire. Without them, there is no Mansa Musa. Without them, there is no story to tell, so let the final image be not of an emperor, but of the land itself. The western Sudan at dawn, the light coming up over the savannah in that slow, inexorable way that tropical dawns have, the sky shifting from black to indigo to violet to the pale gold that preceded the sun's appearance over the eastern horizon. The Harmattan haze softened the light and turned it amber. The Niger, already awake, carried its brown current southward through the floodplain, past the fishing villages where nets were being readied, and past the rice paddies where the season's work would soon begin. The mosques stood silent in the early light, their earthen walls warm to the touch from the previous day's sun, their minarets pointing upward toward a sky that was, for this brief moment, empty of everything except color and light and the first stirring of the day's heat. The land had been there before the empire. It would be there after. The gold lay in the riverbeds and the shallow deposits, patient, elemental, indifferent to the uses that human beings made of it. The rivers flowed according to their own logic, shaped by rainfall and geology and the slow tectonic processes that had created the landscape over millions of years. The savanna stretched in every direction, vast and various and productive, capable of supporting the enormous populations that had built civilizations here for millennia, and that would continue to build them for millennia to come. And somewhere in this landscape, in a city, in a village, in a compound made of the same earth that constituted the landscape itself, a voice was speaking, telling a story, transmitting, across the unbridgeable gap between one generation and the next, the knowledge of what had been accomplished here on this land by these people, in a time that was receding into the past at the rate of 1 day per day, but that had not yet passed beyond the reach of memory. The voice would falter eventually. All voices do. But before it faltered, it would pass the story to another voice, and that voice to another, and that voice to another, in a chain of transmission that had already lasted 7 centuries, and that showed, despite everything, no sign of ending. The light strengthened. The day began. The river flowed on.